Thing 13. Making rich people richer doesn't make the rest of us richer. What they tell you. We have to create wealth before we can share it out. Like it or not, it is the rich people who are going to invest and create jobs. The rich are vital to both spotting market opportunities and exploiting them. In many countries, the politics of envy and populist policies of the past have put restrictions on wealth creation by imposing high taxes on the rich. This has to stop. It may sound harsh, but in the long run poor people can become richer only by making the rich even richer. When you give the rich a bigger slice of the pie, the slices of the others may become smaller in the short run, but the poor will enjoy bigger slices in absolute terms in the long run, because the pie will get bigger. What they don't tell you. The above idea, known as trickle-down economics, stumbles on its first hurdle. Despite the usual dichotomy of growth-enhancing pro-rich policy and growth-reducing pro-poor policy, pro-rich policies have failed to accelerate growth in the last 3 decades. So the first step in this argument, that is, the view that giving a bigger slice of pie to the rich will make the pie bigger, does not hold. The second part of the argument, the view that greater wealth created at the top will eventually trickle down to the poor, does not work either. Trickle down does happen, but usually its impact is meager if we leave it to the market. The ghost of Stalin, or is it Preobrazhensky? With the devastation of the First World War, the Soviet economy was in dire straits in 1919. Realizing that the new regime had no chance of surviving without reviving food production, Lenin launched the new economic policy, NEP, allowing market transactions in agriculture and letting the peasants keep the profits from those transactions. The Bolshevik Party was split. On the left of the party, arguing that the NEP was no more than a regression to capitalism, was Leon Trotsky. He was supported by the brilliant self-taught economist, Yevgeny Preobrazhensky. Preobrazhensky argued that if the Soviet economy was to develop it needed to increase investment in industries. However, Preobrazhensky argued, it was very difficult to increase such investment because virtually all the surplus the economy generated, that is, over and above what was absolutely necessary for the physical survival of its population, was controlled by the farmers, as the economy was mostly agricultural. Therefore, he reasoned, private property and the market should be abolished in the countryside, so that all investable surplus could be squeezed out of it by the government suppressing agricultural prices. Such surplus was then to be shifted to the industrial sector, where the planning authority could make sure that all of it was invested. In the short run, this would suppress living standards, especially for the peasantry, but in the long run it would make everyone better off, because it would maximize investment and therefore the growth potential of the economy. Those on the right of the party, such as Joseph Stalin and Nikolai Bukharin, Preobrazhensky's erstwhile friend and intellectual rival, called for realism. They argued that, even if it was not very communist to allow private property in land and livestock in the countryside, they could not afford to alienate the peasantry, given its predominance. According to Bukharin, there was no other choice than riding into socialism on a peasant nag. Throughout most of the 1920s, the right had the upper hand. Preobrazhensky was increasingly marginalized and forced into exile in 1927. However, in 1928, it all changed. Upon becoming the sole dictator, Stalin filched his rival's ideas and implemented the strategy advocated by Preobrazhensky. He confiscated land from the kulaks, the rich farmers, and brought the entire countryside under state control through collectivization of agriculture. The lands confiscated from the kulaks were turned into state farms, sovkhozs, while small farmers were forced to join cooperatives or collective farms, kolkhoz, with a nominal share ownership. Stalin did not follow Preobrazhensky's recommendation exactly. Actually, he went rather soft on the countryside and did not squeeze the peasants to the maximum. Instead, he imposed lower than subsistence wages on industrial workers, which in turn forced urban women to join the industrial workforce in order to enable their families to survive. Stalin's strategy had huge costs. Millions of people resisting, or being accused of resisting, agricultural collectivization ended up in labor camps. There was a collapse in agricultural output, following the dramatic fall in the number of traction animals, partly due to the slaughtering by their owners in anticipation of confiscation and partly due to the shortage of grains to feed them thanks to forced grain shipments to the cities. This agricultural breakdown resulted in the severe famine of 1932-3 in which millions of people perished. The irony is that, without Stalin adopting Preobrazhensky's strategy, the Soviet Union would not have been able to build the industrial base at such a speed that it was able to repel the Nazi invasion on the Eastern Front in the Second World War. Without the Nazi defeat on the Eastern Front, Western Europe would not have been able to beat the Nazis. Thus, ironically, Western Europeans owe their freedom today to an ultra-left-wing Soviet economist called Preobrazhensky. Why am I nattering on about some forgotten Russian Marxist economist from nearly a century ago? It is because there is a striking parallel between Stalin's, or rather Preobrazhensky's, strategy and today's pro-rich policies advocated by free market economists. Capitalists versus workers. From the 18th century, the feudal order, whereby people were born into certain stations and remained there for the rest of their lives, came under attack from liberals throughout Europe. They argued that people should be rewarded according to their achievements rather than their births, see Thing 20. Of course, these were liberals of 19th century vintage, so they had views that today's liberals, least of all American liberals, who would be called left of center, rather than liberal, in Europe, would find objectionable. Above all, they were against democracy. They believed that giving votes to poor men, women were not even considered, as they were believed to lack full mental faculty, would destroy capitalism. Why was that? The 19th century liberals believed that abstinence was the key to wealth accumulation and thus economic development. Having acquired the fruits of their labor, people need to abstain from instant gratification and invest it if they were to accumulate wealth. In this worldview, the poor were poor because they did not have the character to exercise such abstinence. Therefore, if you gave the poor voting rights, they would want to maximize their current consumption rather than investment by imposing taxes on the rich and spending them. This might make the poor better off in the short run, but it would make them worse off in the long run by reducing investment and thus growth. In their anti-poor politics, the liberals were intellectually supported by the classical economists, with David Ricardo, the 19th century British economist, as the most brilliant of them all. Unlike today's liberal economists, the classical economists did not see the capitalist economy as being made up of individuals. They believed that people belonged to different classes, capitalists, workers and landlords, and behaved differently according to their classes. The most important interclass behavioral difference was considered to be the fact that capitalists invested virtually all of their incomes while the other classes, the working class and the landlord class, consumed them. On the landlord class, opinion was split. Some, like Ricardo, saw it as a consuming class that hampered capital accumulation, while others, such as Thomas Malthus, thought that its consumption helped the capitalist class by offering extra demands for their products. However, on the workers, there was a consensus. They spent all of their income, so if the workers got a higher share of the national income, investment and thus economic growth would fall. This is where ardent free marketeers like Ricardo meet ultra-left-wing communists like Preobrazhensky. Despite their apparent differences, both of them believed that the investable surplus should be concentrated in the hands of the investor, the capitalist class in the case of the former and the planning authority in the case of the latter, in order to maximize economic growth in the long run. This is ultimately what people today have in mind when they say that you first have to create wealth before you can redistribute it. The fall and rise of pro-rich policies. Between the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the worst fears of liberals were realized, and most countries in Europe and the so-called Western offshoots, the US, Canada, Australia and New Zealand, extended suffrage to the poor, naturally only to the males. However, the dreaded overtaxation of the rich and the resulting destruction of capitalism did not happen. In the decades that followed the introduction of universal male suffrage, taxation on the rich and social spending did not increase by much. So, the poor were not that impatient after all. Moreover, when the dreaded overtaxation of the rich started in earnest, it did not destroy capitalism. In fact, it made it even stronger. Following the Second World War, there was a rapid growth in progressive taxation and social welfare spending in most of the rich capitalist countries. Despite this, or rather partly because of this, see Thing 21, the period between 1950 and 1973 saw the highest ever growth rates in these countries, known as the Golden Age of Capitalism. Before the Golden Age, per capita income in the rich capitalist economies used to grow at 1 to 1.5% per year. During the Golden Age, it grew at 2 to 3% in the US and Britain, 4 to 5% in Western Europe, and 8% in Japan. Since then, these countries have never managed to grow faster than that. When growth slowed down in the rich capitalist economies from the mid-1970s, however, the free marketeers dusted off their 19th century rhetoric and managed to convince others that the reduction in the share of the income going to the investing class was the reason for the slowdown. Since the 1980s, in many, although not all, of these countries, governments that espouse upward income redistribution have ruled most of the time. Even some so-called left-wing parties, such as Britain's New Labour under Tony Blair and the American Democratic Party under Bill Clinton, openly advocated such a strategy, the high point being Bill Clinton introducing his welfare reform in 1996, declaring that he wanted to end welfare as we know it. In the event, trimming the welfare state down proved more difficult than initially thought, see Thing 21. However, its growth has been moderated, despite the structural pressure for greater welfare spending due to the aging of the population, which increases the need for pensions, disability allowances, healthcare and other spending directed to the elderly. More importantly, in most countries there were also many policies that ended up redistributing income from the poor to the rich. There have been tax cuts for the rich, top income tax rates were brought down. Financial deregulation has created huge opportunities for speculative gains as well as astronomical paychecks for top managers and financiers. See things 2 and 22. Deregulation in other areas has also allowed companies to make bigger profits, not least because they were more able to exploit their monopoly powers, more freely pollute the environment and more readily sack workers. Increased trade liberalization and increased foreign investment, or at least the threat of them, have also put downward pressure on wages. As a result, income inequality has increased in most rich countries. For example, according to the ILO, International Labor Organization, report, The World of Work 2008, of the 20 advanced economies for which data was available, between 1990 and 2000 income inequality rose in 16 countries, with only Switzerland among the remaining 4 experiencing a significant fall. 1 During this period, income inequality in the US, already by far the highest in the rich world, rose to a level comparable to that of some Latin American countries such as Uruguay and Venezuela. The relative increase in income inequality was also high in countries such as Finland, Sweden and Belgium, but these were countries that previously had very low levels of inequality, perhaps too low in the case of Finland, which had an even more equal income distribution than many of the former socialist countries. According to the Economic Policy Institute, EPI, the center-left think tank in Washington, D.C., between 1979 and 2006, the latest year of available data, the top 1% of earners in the U.S. more than doubled their share of national income, from 10% to 22.9%. The top 0.1% did even better, increasing their share by more than 3 times, from 3.5% in 1979 to 11.6% in 2006.2. This was mainly because of the astronomical increase in executive pay in the country, whose lack of justification is increasingly becoming obvious in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. See Thing 14. Of the 65 developing and former socialist countries covered in the above-mentioned ILO study, income inequality rose in 41 countries during the same period. While the proportion of countries experiencing rising inequality among them was smaller than for the rich countries, many of these countries already had very high inequality, so the impacts of rising inequality were even worse than in the rich countries. Water that does not trickle down. All this upward redistribution of income might have been justified, had it led to accelerated growth. But the fact is that economic growth has actually slowed down since the start of the neoliberal pro-rich reform in the 1980s. According to World Bank data, the world economy used to grow in per capita terms at over 3% during the 1960s and 70s, while since the 1980s it has been growing at the rate of 1.4% per year, 1980 to 2009. In short, since the 1980s, we have given the rich a bigger slice of our pie in the belief that they would create more wealth, making the pie bigger than otherwise possible in the long run. The rich got the bigger slice of the pie all right, but they have actually reduced the pace at which the pie is growing. The problem is that concentrating income in the hands of the supposed investor, be it the capitalist class or Stalin's Central Planning Authority, does not lead to higher growth if the investor fails to invest more. When Stalin concentrated income in Gosplan, the planning authority, there was at least a guarantee that the concentrated income would be turned into investment, even though the productivity of the investment may have been adversely affected by factors such as the difficulty of planning and work incentive problems. See Thing 19. Capitalist economies do not have such a mechanism. Indeed, despite rising inequality since the 1980s, investment as a ratio of national output has fallen in all G7 economies, the US, Japan, Germany, the UK, Italy, France and Canada, and in most developing countries. See Things 2 and 6. Even when upward income redistribution creates more wealth than otherwise possible, which has not happened, I repeat, there is no guarantee that the poor will benefit from those extra incomes. Increasing prosperity at the top might eventually trickle down and benefit the poor, but this is not a foregone conclusion. Of course, trickle down is not a completely stupid idea. We cannot judge the impact of income redistribution only by its immediate effects, however good or bad they may look. When rich people have more money, they may use it to increase investment and growth, in which case the long-run effect of upward income redistribution may be the growth in the absolute size, although not necessarily the relative share, of income that everyone gets. However, the trouble is that trickle-down usually does not happen very much if left to the market. For example, once again according to the EPI, the top 10% of the U.S. population appropriated 91% of income growth between 1989 and 2006, while the top 1% took 59%. In contrast, in countries with a strong welfare state it is a lot easier to spread the benefits of extra growth that follows upward income redistribution, if it happens, through taxes and transfers. Indeed, before taxes and transfers, income distribution is actually more unequal in Belgium and Germany than in the US, while in Sweden and the Netherlands it is more or less the same as in the US. 3 In other words, we need the electric pump of the welfare state to make the water at the top trickle down in any significant quantity. Last but not least, there are many reasons to believe that downward income redistribution can help growth, if done in the right way at the right time. For example, in an economic downturn like today's, the best way to boost the economy is to redistribute wealth downward, as poorer people tend to spend a higher proportion of their incomes. The economy-boosting effect of the extra $1 billion given to the lower-income households through increased welfare spending will be bigger than the same amount given to the rich through tax cuts. Moreover, if wages are not stuck at or below subsistence levels, additional income may encourage workers' investment in education and health, which may raise their productivity and thus economic growth. In addition, greater income equality may promote social peace by reducing industrial strikes and crime, which may in turn encourage investment, as it reduces the danger of disruption to the production process and thus to the process of generating wealth. Many scholars believe that such a mechanism was at work during the golden age of capitalism, when low income inequality coexisted with rapid growth. Thus seen, there is no reason to presume that upward income redistribution will accelerate investment and growth. This has not happened in general. Even when there is more growth, the trickle-down that occurs through the market mechanism is very limited, as seen in the above comparison of the US with other rich countries with a good welfare state. Simply making the rich richer does not make the rest of us richer. If giving more to the rich is going to benefit the rest of the society, the rich have to be made to deliver higher investment and thus higher growth through policy measures, e.g., tax cuts for the rich individuals and corporations, conditional on investment, and then share the fruits of such growth through a mechanism such as the welfare state. Thing 14. U.S. managers are overpriced. What they tell you. Some people are paid a lot more than others. Especially in the U.S., companies pay their top managers what some people consider to be obscene amounts. However, this is what market forces demand. Given that the pool of talent is limited, you simply have to pay large sums of money if you are to attract the best talents. From the point of view of a giant corporation with billions of dollars of turnover, it is definitely worth paying extra millions, or even tens of millions, of dollars to get the best talent, as her ability to make better decisions than her counterparts in competitor companies can bring in extra hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. However unjust these levels of compensation may appear, we should not engage in acts of envy and spite and try to artificially suppress them. Such attempts would be simply counterproductive. What they don't tell you. U.S. managers are overpriced in more than one sense. First, they are overpriced compared to their predecessors. In relative terms, that is, as a proportion of average worker compensation, American CEOs today are paid around 10 times more than their predecessors of the 1960s, despite the fact that the latter ran companies that were much more successful, in relative terms, than today's American companies. U.S. managers are also overpriced compared to their counterparts in other rich countries. In absolute terms, they are paid, depending on the measure we use in the country we compare with, up to 20 times more than their competitors running similarly large and successful companies. American managers are not only overpriced but also overly protected in the sense that they do not get punished for poor performance. And all this is not, unlike what many people argue, purely dictated by market forces. The managerial class in the U.S. has gained such economic, political and ideological power that it has been able to manipulate the forces that determine its pay. Executive pay and the politics of class envy. The average CEO compensation, salaries, bonuses, pensions and stock options, in the U.S. is 300 to 400 times the average worker compensation, wages and benefits. Some people are terribly upset about this. For example, Mr. Barack Obama, the U.S. president, is frequently quoted criticizing what he sees as excessive executive pay. Free market economists see no problem in this pay disparity. If the CEOs are paid 300 times more than the average worker, they say, it must be because they add 300 times more value to the company. If someone does not have the productivity to justify her high pay, market forces will soon ensure that she is sacked, see Thing 3. Those who raise issues with executive pay, like Mr. Obama, are populists who engage in the politics of class envy. Unless those who are less productive accept, they argue, that people need to be paid according to their productivity, capitalism cannot function properly. One could almost believe in the above arguments if one made a small concession, ignoring the facts. I am not disputing that some people are more productive than others and that they need to be paid more, sometimes a lot more, although they should not be too smug about it, see Thing 3. The real question is whether the current degree of difference is justified. Now, accurately totting up executive pay is very difficult. To begin with, the disclosure of executive pay is not very good in many countries. When we look at compensation as a whole, rather than just salaries, we need to include stock options. Stock options give the recipient the right to buy a certain number of the company's stocks in the future, so they do not have an exact value in the present and their value needs to be estimated. Depending on the methodology used for the estimation, the valuation can vary a lot. As mentioned earlier, bearing these caveats in mind, the ratio of CEO compensation to average worker compensation in the US used to be in the region of 30 to 40 to 1 in the 1960s and 70s. This ratio has grown at a rapid rate since the early 1980s, reaching around 100 to 1 in the early 1990s and rising to 300 to 400 to 1 by the 2000s. Contrast this to the changes in what the American workers get. According to the Economic Policy Institute, EPI, the Washington-based center-left think tank, the average hourly wage for the U.S. workers in 2007, that is, adjusted for inflation, rose from $18.90 in 1973 to $21.34 in 2006. That is a 13% increase in 33 years, which is around 0.4% growth per year. Point 1. The picture is even bleaker when we look at overall compensation, wages plus benefits, and not just wages. Even if we look at only the recovery periods, given that worker compensation falls during recessions, median worker compensation rose at the rate of 0.2% per year during 1983 to 9, at the rate of 0.1% per year between 1992 and 2000, and did not grow at all during 2002-7.2. In other words, worker pay in the US has been virtually stagnant since the mid-1970s. Of course, this is not to say that Americans have not seen any rise in living standards since the 1970s. Family income, as opposed to individual worker compensation, has risen, but that is only because more and more families have both partners working. Now, if we believed in the free market logic that people are paid according to their contribution, the increase in the relative compensation of the CEOs from 30 to 40 times that of average worker compensation, which has not changed very much, to 300 to 400 times must mean that the American CEOs have become 10 times more productive, in relative terms, than they were in the 1960s and 70s. Is this true? The average quality of US managers may have been rising due to better education and training, but is it really plausible that they are 10 times better than their equivalents were one generation ago? Even looking back at only the last 20 years, during which time I have been teaching in Cambridge, I sincerely doubt whether the American students we get who are potential CEO material are 3 to 4 times better today than when I started teaching in the early 1990s. But that should be the case, if American CEO pay had risen in relative terms purely because of the rising quality of the CEOs. During this period, the average CEO compensation in the US rose from 100 times the average worker compensation to 300 to 400 times. A common explanation of this recent steep rise in relative pay is that companies have become bigger and therefore the difference that the CEO can make has become bigger. According to a popular example used by Professor Robert H. Frank of Cornell University in his widely cited New York Times column, if a company has $10 billion earnings, a few better decisions made by a better CEO can easily increase the company's earnings by $30 million. Point 3. So, the implicit message goes, what is an extra $5 million for the CEO, when she has given an extra $30 million to the company? There is some logic to this argument, but if the growing size of the company is the main explanation for CEO pay inflation, why did it suddenly take off in the 1980s, when US company size has been growing all the time? Also, the same argument should apply to the workers as well, at least to some extent. Modern corporations work on the basis of complex divisions of labor and cooperation, so the view that what the CEO does is the only thing that matters for company performance is highly misleading. See Things 3 and 15. As companies grow bigger, the potential for workers benefiting or damaging the company grows bigger as well, and therefore it becomes more and more important to hire better workers. If that were not the case, why do companies bother with human resources departments? Moreover, if the increasing importance of top managerial decisions is the main reason for CEO salary inflation, why are CEOs in Japan and Europe running similarly large companies paid only a fraction of what the American CEOs are paid? According to the EPI, as of 2005, Swiss and German CEOs were paid respectively 64% and 55% of what their American counterparts received. The Swedish and the Dutch were paid only around 44% and 40% of the American CEO's pay. Japanese CEOs only a paltry 25%. The average CEO pay for 13 rich countries other than the US was only 44% of the US level. Point 4. The above figures actually vastly understate the international differences in CEO remuneration, as they do not include stock options, which tend to be much higher in the US than in other countries. Other data from the EPI suggest that, In the US, CEO pay including stock options could be easily 3 to 4 times, and possibly 5 to 6 times, that of their pay excluding stock options, although it is difficult to know exactly the magnitude involved. This means that, if we include stock options, the Japanese CEO compensation, with only a small stock option component, if at all, could be as low as 5%, instead of 25%, that of US CEO compensation. Now, if the American CEOs are worth anything between twice, compared to the Swiss CEOs, excluding stock options, and 20 times, compared to the Japanese CEOs, including stock options, their counterparts abroad, how come the companies they run have been losing out to their Japanese and European rivals in many industries? You may suggest that the Japanese and European CEOs can work at much lower absolute pay than the American CEOs because their country's general wage levels are lower. However, wages in Japan and the European countries are basically at the same level as those in the US. The average worker pay in the 13 countries studied by the EPI was 85% of the US worker pay in 2005. The Japanese workers get paid 91% the American wages, but their CEOs get paid only 25% of what the American CEOs get, excluding stock options. The Swiss workers and the German workers get higher wages than the US workers, 130% and 106% of the US wage, respectively, while their CEOs get paid only 55% and 64% of the US salaries, once again, excluding share options, which are much higher in the US, 0.5. Thus seen, US managers are overpriced. The American workers get paid only 15% or so more than their counterparts in competitor nations, while the American CEOs are paid at least twice, compared to the Swiss managers, excluding stock options, and possibly up to 20 times, compared to the Japanese managers, including stock options, that of what their counterparts in comparable countries are paid. Despite this, the American CEOs are running companies that are no better, and frequently worse, than their Japanese or European competitors. Heads I win, tails you lose. In the US and the UK, which has the second highest CEO worker pay ratio after the US, the compensation packages for top managers are loaded in one way. Apart from being paid excessive amounts, these managers do not get punished for bad management. The most that will happen to them is to be kicked out of their current job, but that will almost always be accompanied by a fat severance payment check. Sometimes the expelled CEO will get even more than what is required in the contract. According to two economists, Bebchik and Fried, when Mattel CEO Jill Barad resigned under fire, in 2000, the board forgave a $4.2 million loan, gave her an additional $3.3 million in cash to cover the taxes for forgiveness of another loan and allowed her unvested options to vest automatically. These gratuitous benefits were in addition to the considerable benefits that she received under her employment agreement, which included a termination payment of $26.4 million and a stream of retirement benefits exceeding $700,000 per year. 6. Should we care? Not really, free market economists would argue. If some companies are stupid enough to pay gratuitous benefits to failed CEOs, they would say, let them do it. They will be outcompeted by more hard-nosed competitors that do not engage in such nonsense. So, even though there may be some poorly designed compensation schemes around, they will eventually be eliminated through competitive pressures of the market. This seems plausible. The competitive process works to eliminate inefficient practices, be they obsolete textile technologies or biased executive pay schemes. And the fact that American and British companies have been losing to foreign companies, which on the whole have better managerial incentives, is a proof of it. However, it will take a long time for this process to eliminate wrong managerial compensation practices. After all, this has been going on for decades. Before its recent bankruptcy, people had known for at least 3 decades that GM was on a decline, but no one did anything to stop the top managers from receiving compensation packages more fitting to their predecessors in the mid-20th century, when the company had absolute dominance worldwide. See Thing 18. Despite this, little is done to check excessive and biased, in that failures are hardly punished, executive pay packages because the managerial classes in the US and Britain have become so powerful, not least because of the fat paychecks they have been getting over the last few decades. They have come to control the boardrooms, through interlocking directorship and manipulation of information that they provide to independent directors, and as a result few boards of directors question the level and the structure of executive pay set by the CEO. High and rising dividend payments also keep the shareholders happy. See Thing 2. By flexing their economic muscle, the managerial classes have gained enormous influence over the political sphere, including the supposedly center-left parties such as Britain's New Labour and America's Democratic Party. Especially in the US, many private sector CEOs end up running government departments. Most importantly, they have used their economic and political influence to spread the free market ideology that says that whatever exists must be there because it is the most efficient. The power of this managerial class has been most vividly demonstrated by the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. When the American and the British governments injected astronomical sums of taxpayers' money into troubled financial institutions in the autumn of 2008. Few of the managers who were responsible for their institution's failure were punished. Yes, a small number of CEOs have lost their jobs, but few of those who have remained in their jobs have taken a serious pay cut, and there has been an enormous and effective resistance to the attempt by the US Congress to put a cap on pay of the managers of financial firms receiving taxpayers' money. The British government refused to do anything about the £15 to 20 million pensions payout, which gives him around £700,000 yearly income, to the disgraced former boss of the RBS, Royal Bank of Scotland, Sir Fred Goodwin, although the intense negative publicity forced him subsequently to return £4 million. The fact that the British and the American taxpayers, who have become the shareholders of the bailed-out financial institutions, cannot even punish their now employees for poor performance and force them to accept a more efficient compensation scheme shows the extent of power that the managerial class now possesses in these countries. Markets weed out inefficient practices, but only when no one has sufficient power to manipulate them. Moreover, even if they are eventually weeded out, one-sided managerial compensation packages impose huge costs on the rest of the economy while they last. The workers have to be constantly squeezed through downward pressure on wages, casualization of employment and permanent downsizing, so that the managers can generate enough extra profits to distribute to the shareholders and keep them from raising issues with high executive pay. For more on this, see Thing 2. Having to maximize dividends to keep the shareholders quiet, investment is minimized, weakening the company's long-term productive capabilities. When combined with excessive managerial pay, this puts the American and British firms at a disadvantage in international competition, eventually costing the workers their jobs. Finally, when things go wrong on a large scale, as in the 2008 financial crisis, taxpayers are forced to bail out the failed companies, while the managers who created the failure get off almost scot-free. When the managerial classes in the US and, to a lesser extent Britain, possess such economic, political and ideological power that they can manipulate the market and pass on the negative consequences of their actions to other people, it is an illusion to think that executive pay is something whose optimal levels and structures are going to be, and should be, determined by the market. Thing 15. People in poor countries are more entrepreneurial than people in rich countries. What they tell you. Entrepreneurship is at the heart of economic dynamism. Unless there are entrepreneurs who seek out new money-making opportunities by generating new products and meeting unmet demands, the economy cannot develop. Indeed, one of the reasons behind the lack of economic dynamism in a range of countries, from France to all those states in the developing world, is the lack of entrepreneurship. Unless all those people who aimlessly loiter around in poor countries change their attitudes and actively seek out profit-making opportunities, their countries are not going to develop. What they don't tell you. People who live in poor countries have to be very entrepreneurial even just to survive. For every loiterer in a developing country, you have 2 or 3 children shining shoes and 4 or 5 people hawking things. What makes the poor countries poor is not the absence of entrepreneurial energy at the personal level, but the absence of productive technologies and developed social organizations, especially modern firms. The increasingly apparent problems with microcredit, very small loans given to poor people in developing countries with the pronounced aim of helping them set up businesses, shows the limitations of individual entrepreneurship. Especially in the last century, entrepreneurship has become a collective activity, so the poverty of collective organization has become an even bigger obstacle to economic development rather than the deficient entrepreneurial spirits of individuals. The problem with the French. George W. Bush, the former US president, is reputed to have complained that the problem with the French is that they do not have a word for entrepreneurship in their language. His French may not have been up to scratch, but Mr. Bush was articulating a fairly common Anglo-American prejudice against France as an undynamic and backward-looking country full of lazy workers, sheep-burning farmers, pretentious left-wing intellectuals, meddling bureaucrats and, last but not least, pompous waiters. Whether or not Mr. Bush's conception of France is right, more on this later, and see Thing 10, the perspective behind his statement is widely accepted. You need entrepreneurial people to have a successful economy. In this view, the poverty of the developing countries is also attributed to the lack of entrepreneurship in those countries. Look at all those men sitting around having their 11th cup of mint tea of the day. Observers from the rich countries say, these countries really need more go-getters and movers and shakers in order to pull themselves out of poverty. However, anyone who is from or has lived for a period in a developing country will know that it is teeming with entrepreneurs. On the streets of poor countries, you will meet men, women and children of all ages selling everything you can think of, and things that you did not even know could be bought. In many poor countries, you can buy a place in the queue for the visa section of the American embassy, sold to you by professional queuers. The service to watch your car, meaning, refrain from damaging your car. In street parking slots, the right to set up a food stall on a particular corner, perhaps sold by the corrupt local police boss. Or even a patch of land to beg from, sold to you by the local thugs. These are all products of human ingenuity and entrepreneurship. In contrast, most citizens of rich countries have not even come near to becoming entrepreneurs. They mostly work for a company, some of them employing tens of thousands, doing highly specialized and narrowly specified jobs. Even though some of them dream of, or at least idly talk about, setting up their own businesses and becoming my own bosses, few put it into practice because it is a difficult and risky thing to do. As a result, most people from rich countries spend their working lives implementing someone else's entrepreneurial vision, and not their own. The upshot is that people are far more entrepreneurial in the developing countries than in the developed countries. According to an OECD study, in most developing countries 30 to 50% of the non-agricultural workforce is self-employed. The ratio tends to be even higher in agriculture. In some of the poorest countries, the ratio of people working as one-person entrepreneurs can be way above that, 66.9% in Ghana, 75.4% in Bangladesh, and a staggering 88.7% in Benin. 1 In contrast, only 12.8% of the non-agricultural workforce in developed countries is self-employed. In some countries the ratio does not even reach 1 in 10. 6.7% in Norway, 7.5% in the US, and 8.6% in France. It turns out that Mr. Bush's complaint about the French was a classic case of the pot calling the kettle black. So, even excluding the farmers, which would make the ratio even higher, the chance of an average developing country person being an entrepreneur is more than twice that for a developed country person, 30% versus 12.8%. The difference is 10 times, if we compare Bangladesh with the US, 7.5% versus 75.4%. And in the most extreme case, the chance of someone from Benin being an entrepreneur is a whopping 13 times higher than the equivalent chance for a Norwegian, 88.7% versus 6.7%. Moreover, even those people who are running businesses in the rich countries need not be as entrepreneurial as their counterparts in the poor countries. For developing country entrepreneurs, things go wrong all the time. There are power cuts that screw up the production schedule. Customs won't clear the spare parts needed to fix a machine, which has been delayed anyway due to problems with the permit to buy US dollars. Inputs are not delivered at the right time, as the delivery truck broke down, yet again, due to potholes on the road. And the petty local officials are bending, and even inventing, rules all the time in order to extract bribes. Coping with all these obstacles requires agile thinking and the ability to improvise. An average American businessman would not last a week in the face of these problems if he were made to manage a small company in Maputo or Phnom Penh. So we are faced with an apparent puzzle. Compared to the rich countries, we have far more people in developing countries, in proportional terms, engaged in entrepreneurial activities. On top of that, their entrepreneurial skills are much more frequently and severely tested than those of their counterparts in the rich countries. Then how is it that these more entrepreneurial countries are the poorer ones? Great expectations, microfinance enters the scene. The seemingly boundless entrepreneurial energy of poor people in poor countries has, of course, not gone unnoticed. There is an increasingly influential view that the engine of development for poor countries should be the so-called informal sector, made up of small businesses that are not registered with the government. The entrepreneurs in the informal sector, it is argued, are struggling not because they lack the necessary vision and skills but because they cannot get the money to realize their visions. The regular banks discriminate against them, while the local moneylenders charge prohibitive rates of interest. If they are given a small amount of credit, known as a microcredit, at a reasonable interest rate to set up a food stall, buy a mobile phone to rent out, or get some chickens to sell their eggs, they will be able to pull themselves out of poverty. With these small enterprises making up the bulk of the developing country's economy, their successes would translate into overall economic development. The invention of microcredit is commonly attributed to Muhammad Yunus, the economics professor who has been the public face of the microcredit industry since he set up the pioneering Grameen Bank in his native Bangladesh in 1983, although there were similar attempts before. Despite lending to poor people, especially poor women, who were traditionally considered to be high-risk cases, the Grameen Bank boasted a very high repayment ratio, 95% or more, showing that the poor are highly bankable. By the early 1990s, the success of the Grameen Bank, and of some similar banks in countries such as Bolivia, was noticed, and the idea of microcredit, or more broadly microfinance, which includes savings and insurance, and not just credit, spread fast. The recipe sounds perfect. Microcredit allows the poor to get out of poverty through their own efforts, by providing them with the financial means to realize their entrepreneurial potential. In the process, they gain independence and self-respect, as they are no longer relying on handouts from the government and foreign aid agencies for their survival. Poor women are particularly empowered by microcredit, as it gives them the ability to earn an income and thus improve their bargaining positions vis-a-vis their male partners. Not having to subsidize the poor, the government feels less pressure on its budget. The wealth created in the process, naturally, makes the overall economy, and not just the informal sector entrepreneurs, richer. Given all this, it is not a surprise that Professor Yunus believes that, with the help of microfinance, we can create a poverty-free world, where the only place you can see poverty is in the museum. By the mid-2000s, the popularity of microfinance reached fever pitch. The year 2005 was designated the International Year of Microcredit by the United Nations, with endorsements from royalty, like Queen Rania of Jordan, and celebrities, like the actresses Natalie Portman and Aishwarya Rai. The ascendancy of microfinance reached its peak in 2006 when the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded jointly to Professor Yunus and his Grameen Bank. The grand illusion. Unfortunately, the hype about microfinance is, well, just that, hype. There are growing criticisms of microfinance, even by some of its early priests. For example, in a recent paper with David Rudman, Jonathan Mordich, a longtime advocate of microfinance, confesses that, strikingly, 30 years into the microfinance movement we have little solid evidence that it improves the lives of clients in measurable ways. Point 2 The problems are too numerous even to list here. Anyone who is interested can read the fascinating recent book by Milford Bateman, Why Doesn't Microfinance Work? 3 But those most relevant to our discussion are as follows. The microfinance industry has always boasted that its operations remain profitable without government subsidies or contributions from international donors, except perhaps in the initial teething phase. Some have used this as evidence that the poor are as good at playing the market as anyone else, if you will just let them. However, it turns out that, without subsidies from governments or international donors, microfinance institutions have to charge, and have been charging, near usurious rates. It has been revealed that the Grameen Bank could initially charge reasonable interest rates only because of the hushed-up subsidies it was getting from the Bangladeshi government and international donors. If they are not subsidized, microfinance institutions have to charge interest rates of typically 40 to 50% for their loans, with rates as high as 80 to 100% in countries such as Mexico. When, in the late 1990s, it came under pressure to give up the subsidies, the Grameen Bank had to relaunch itself, in 2001, and start charging interest rates of 40 to 50%. With interest rates running up to 100%, few businesses can make the necessary profits to repay the loans, so most of the loans made by microfinance institutions, in some cases as high as 90%, have been used for the purpose of consumption smoothing, people taking out loans to pay for their daughter's wedding or to make up for a temporary fall in income due to the illness of a working family member. In other words, the vast bulk of microcredit is not used to fuel entrepreneurship by the poor, the alleged goal of the exercise, but to finance consumption. More importantly, even the small portion of microcredit that goes into business activities is not pulling people out of poverty. At first, this sounds inexplicable. Those poor people who take out microcredit know what they're doing. Unlike their counterparts in rich countries, most of them have run businesses of one kind or another. Their business wits are sharpened to the limit by their desperation to survive and sheer desire to get out of poverty. They have to generate very high profits because they have to pay the market rate of interest. So what is going wrong? Why are all these people, highly motivated, in possession of relevant skills and strongly pressured by the market, making huge efforts with their business ventures, producing such meager results? When a microfinance institution first starts its operation in a locality, the first posse of its clients may see their income rising, sometimes quite dramatically. For example, when in 1997 the Grameen Bank teamed up with Telenor, the Norwegian phone company, and gave out microloans to women to buy a mobile phone and rent it out to their villagers, these telephone ladies made handsome profits minus $750 to $1,200 in a country whose annual average per capita income was around $300. However, over time, the businesses financed by microcredit become crowded and their earnings fall. To go back to the Grameen phone case, by 2005 there were so many telephone ladies that their income was estimated to be around only $70 per year, even though the national average income had gone up to over $450. This problem is known as the fallacy of composition. The fact that some people can succeed with a particular business does not mean that everyone can succeed with it. Of course, this problem would not exist if new business lines could be constantly developed. If one line of activity becomes unprofitable due to overcrowding, you simply open up another. So, for example, if phone renting becomes less profitable, you could maintain your level of income by manufacturing mobile phones or writing the software for mobile phone games. You will obviously have noticed the absurdity of these suggestions. The telephone ladies of Bangladesh simply do not have the wherewithal to move into phone manufacturing or software design. The problem is that there is only a limited range of simple businesses that the poor in developing countries can take on, given their limited skills, the narrow range of technologies available, and the limited amount of finance that they can mobilize through microfinance. So, you, a Croatian farmer who bought one more milk cow with a microcredit, stick to selling milk even as you watch the bottom falling out of your local milk market thanks to the 300 other farmers like you selling more milk, because turning yourself into an exporter of butter to Germany or cheese to Britain simply isn't possible with the technologies, the organizational skills and the capital you have. No more heroes anymore. Our discussion so far shows that what makes the poor countries poor is not the lack of raw individual entrepreneurial energy, which they in fact have in abundance. The point is that what really makes the rich countries rich is their ability to channel the individual entrepreneurial energy into collective entrepreneurship. Very much influenced by capitalist folklore, with characters such as Thomas Edison and Bill Gates, and by the pioneering work of Joseph Schumpeter, the Austrian-born Harvard economics professor, our view of entrepreneurship is too much tinged by the individualistic perspective. Entrepreneurship is what those heroic individuals with exceptional vision and determination do. By extension, we believe that any individual, if they try hard enough, can become successful in business. However, if it ever was true, this individualistic view of entrepreneurship is becoming increasingly obsolete. In the course of capitalist development, entrepreneurship has become an increasingly collective endeavor. To begin with, even exceptional individuals like Edison and Gates have become what they have only because they were supported by a whole host of collective institutions. See Thing 3. The whole scientific infrastructure that enabled them to acquire their knowledge and also experiment with it. The company law and other commercial laws that made it possible for them subsequently to build companies with large and complex organizations. The educational system that supplied highly trained scientists, engineers, managers and workers that manned those companies. The financial system that enabled them to raise a huge amount of capital when they wanted to expand. The patent and copyright laws that protected their inventions, the easily accessible market for their products, and so on. Furthermore, in the rich countries, enterprises cooperate with each other a lot more than do their counterparts in poor countries, even if they operate in similar industries. For example, the dairy sectors in countries such as Denmark, the Netherlands and Germany have become what they are today only because their farmers organized themselves, with state help, into cooperatives and jointly invested in processing facilities, e.g., creaming machines, and overseas marketing. In contrast, the dairy sectors in the Balkan countries have failed to develop despite quite a large amount of microcredit channeled into them, because all their dairy farmers tried to make it on their own. For another example, many small firms in Italy and Germany jointly invest in R&D and export marketing, which are beyond their individual means, through industry associations helped by government subsidies, whereas typical developing country firms do not invest in these areas because they do not have such a collective mechanism. Even at the firm level, entrepreneurship has become highly collective in the rich countries. Today, few companies are managed by charismatic visionaries like Edison and Gates, but by professional managers. Writing in the mid-20th century, Schumpeter was already aware of this trend, although he was none too happy about it. He observed that the increasing scale of modern technologies was making it increasingly impossible for a large company to be established and run by a visionary individual entrepreneur. Schumpeter predicted that the displacement of heroic entrepreneurs with what he called executive types would sap the dynamism from capitalism and eventually lead to its demise. See Thing 2. Schumpeter has been proven wrong in this regard. Over the last century, the heroic entrepreneur has increasingly become a rarity in the process of innovation in products, processes and marketing. The key elements of Schumpeter's entrepreneurship has become increasingly collectivist in its nature. Yet, despite this, the world economy has grown much faster since the Second World War, compared to the period before it. In the case of Japan, the firms have even developed institutional mechanisms to exploit the creativity of even the lowliest production line workers. Many attribute the success of the Japanese firms, at least partly, to this characteristic. See Thing 5. If effective entrepreneurship ever was a purely individual thing, it has stopped being so at least for the last century. The collective ability to build and manage effective organizations and institutions is now far more important than the drives or even the talents of a nation's individual members in determining its prosperity. See Thing 17. Unless we reject the myth of heroic individual entrepreneurs and help them build institutions and organizations of collective entrepreneurship, we will never see the poor countries grow out of poverty on a sustainable basis. Thing 16. We are not smart enough to leave things to the market. What they tell you. We should leave markets alone, because, essentially, market participants know what they are doing. That is, they are rational. Since individuals, and firms as collections of individuals who share the same interests, have their own best interests in mind, and since they know their own circumstances best, attempts by outsiders, especially the government, to restrict the freedom of their actions can only produce inferior results. It is presumptuous of any government to prevent market agents from doing things they find profitable or to force them to do things they do not want to do, when it possesses inferior information. What they don't tell you. People do not necessarily know what they are doing, because our ability to comprehend even matters that concern us directly is limited, or, in the jargon, we have bounded rationality. The world is very complex and our ability to deal with it is severely limited. Therefore, we need to, and usually do, deliberately restrict our freedom of choice in order to reduce the complexity of problems we have to face. Often, government regulation works, especially in complex areas like the modern financial market, not because the government has superior knowledge but because it restricts choices and thus the complexity of the problems at hand, thereby reducing the possibility that things may go wrong. Markets may fail, but, as expressed by Adam Smith in The Idea of the Invisible Hand, free market economists argue that the beauty of the free market is that the decisions of isolated individuals, and firms, get reconciled without anybody consciously trying to do so. What makes this possible is that economic actors are rational, in the sense that they know best their own situations and the ways to improve them. It is possible, it is admitted, that certain individuals are irrational or even that a generally rational individual behaves irrationally on occasion. However, in the long run, the market will weed out irrational behaviors by punishing them. For example, investors who, irrationally, invest in overpriced assets will reap low returns, which forces them either to adjust their behavior or be wiped out. Given this, free market economists argue, leaving it up to the individuals to decide what to do is the best way to manage the market economy. Of course, few people would argue that markets are perfect. Even Milton Friedman admitted that there are instances in which markets fail. Pollution is a classic example. People overproduce pollution because they are not paying for the costs of dealing with it. So what are optimal levels of pollution for individuals or individual firms? Add up to a suboptimal level from the social point of view. However, free market economists are quick to point out that market failures, while theoretically possible, are rare in reality. Moreover, they argue, often the best solution to market failures is to introduce more market forces. For example, they argue that the way to reduce pollution is to create a market for it, by creating tradable emission rights, which allow people to sell and buy the rights to pollute according to their needs within a socially optimal maximum. On top of that, free market economists add, governments also fail, see Thing 12. Governments may lack the necessary information to correct market failures. Or they may be run by politicians and bureaucrats who promote their own interests rather than national interests, see Thing 5. All this means that usually the costs of government failure are greater than the costs of market failure that it is, allegedly, trying to fix. Therefore, free market economists point out, the presence of market failure does not justify government intervention. The debate on the relative importance of market failures and government failures still rages on, and I am not going to be able to conclude that debate here. However, in this thing, I can at least point out that the problem with the free market does not end with the fact that individually rational actions can lead to a collective irrational outcome, that is, market failure. The problem is that we are not even rational to begin with. And when the rationality assumption does not hold, we need to think about the role of the market and of the government in a very different way even from the market failure framework, which after all also assumes that we are rational. Let me explain. If you're so smart. In 1997, Robert Merton and Myron Scholes were awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics for their new method to determine the value of derivatives. Incidentally, the prize is not a real Nobel Prize but a prize given by the Swedish Central Bank, in memory of Alfred Nobel. As a matter of fact, several years ago the Nobel family even threatened to deny the prize the use of their ancestor's name, as it had been mostly given to free market economists of whom Alfred Nobel would not have approved, but that is another story. In 1998, a huge hedge fund called Long-Term Capital Management, LTCM, was on the verge of bankruptcy, following the Russian financial crisis. The fund was so large that its bankruptcy was expected to bring everyone else down with it. The U.S. financial system avoided a collapse only because the Federal Reserve Board, the U.S. central bank, twisted the arms of the dozen or so creditor banks to inject money into the company and become reluctant shareholders, gaining control over 90% of the shares. LTCM was eventually folded in 2000. LTCM, founded in 1994 by the famous, now infamous, financier John Meriwether, had on its board of directors, would you believe it? Merton and Scholes. Merton and Scholes were not just lending their names to the company for a fat check. They were working partners and the company was actively using their asset pricing model. Undeterred by the LTCM debacle, Scholes went on to set up another hedge fund in 1999, Platinum Grove Asset Management, PGAM. The new backers, one can only surmise, thought that the Merton-Scholes model must have failed back in 1998 due to a totally unpredictable sui generis event, the Russian crisis. After all, wasn't it still the best asset pricing model available in the history of humanity, approved by the Nobel Committee? The investors in PGAM were, unfortunately, proven wrong. In November 2008, it practically went bust, temporarily freezing investor withdrawal. The only comfort they could take was probably that they were not alone in being failed by a Nobel laureate. The Trinzem Group, for which Scholes' former partner, Merton, was the chief science officer, also went bankrupt in January 2009. There is a saying in Korea that even a monkey can fall from a tree. Yes, we all make mistakes, and one failure, even if it is a gigantic one like LTCM, we can accept as a mistake. But the same mistake twice? Then you know that the first mistake was not really a mistake. Merton and Scholes did not know what they were doing. When Nobel Prize winners in economics, especially those who got the prize for their work on asset pricing, cannot read the financial market, how can we run the world according to an economic principle that assumes people always know what they are doing and therefore should be left alone? As Alan Greenspan, former chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, had to admit in a congressional hearing, it was a mistake to presume that the self-interest of organizations, specifically banks, is such that they were best capable of protecting shareholders and equity in the firms. Self-interest will protect people only when they know what is going on and how to deal with it. There are many stories coming out of the 2008 financial crisis that show how the supposedly smartest people did not truly understand what they were doing. We are not talking about the Hollywood big shots, such as Steven Spielberg and John Malkovich, or the legendary baseball pitcher Sandy Koufax, depositing their money with the fraudster Bernie Madoff. While these people are among the world's best in what they do, they may not necessarily understand finance. We are talking about the expert fund managers, top bankers, including some of the world's largest banks, such as the British HSBC and the Spanish Santander, and world-class colleges, New York University and Bard College, which had access to some of the world's most reputed economics faculty members, falling for the same trick by Madoff. Worse, it isn't just a matter of being deceived by fraudsters like Madoff or Alan Stanford. The failure by the bankers and other supposed experts in the field to understand what was going on has been pervasive, even when it comes to legitimate finance. One of them apparently shocked Alistair Darling, then British Chancellor of the Exchequer, by telling him in the summer of 2008 that, from now on we will only lend when we understand the risks involved. Point one for another, even more astonishing, example, only 6 months before the collapse of AIG, the American insurance company bailed out by the U.S. government in the autumn of 2008, its chief financial officer, Joe Cassano, is reported to have said that, "It is hard for us, without being flippant, to even see a scenario within any kind of realm of reason that would see us losing $1 in any of the credit default swap, or CDs, transactions." Most of you, especially if you are an American taxpayer cleaning up Mr. Cassano's mess, might find that supposed lack of flippancy less than amusing, given that AIG went bust because of its failure in its $441 billion portfolio of CDs, rather than its core insurance business. When the Nobel Prize winners in financial economics, top bankers, high-flying fund managers, prestigious colleges and the smartest celebrities have shown that they do not understand what they are doing, how can we accept economic theories that work only because they assume that people are fully rational? The upshot is that we are simply not smart enough to leave the market alone. But where do we go from there? Is it possible to think about regulating the market when we are not even smart enough to leave it alone? The answer is yes. Actually, it is more than that. Very often, we need regulation exactly because we are not smart enough. Let me show why. The last Renaissance man, Herbert Simon, the winner of the 1978 Nobel Prize in Economics, was arguably the last Renaissance man on Earth. He started out as a political scientist and moved on to the study of public administration, writing the classic book in the field, Administrative Behavior. Throwing in a couple of papers in physics along the way, he moved into the study of organizational behavior, business administration, economics, cognitive psychology and artificial intelligence, AI. If anyone understood how people think and organize themselves, it was Simon. Simon argued that our rationality is bounded. He did not believe that we are entirely irrational, although he himself and many other economists of the behavioralist school, as well as many cognitive psychologists, have convincingly documented how much of our behavior is irrational. Point 2. According to Simon, we try to be rational, but our ability to be so is severely limited. The world is too complex, Simon argued, for our limited intelligence to understand fully. This means that very often the main problem we face in making a good decision is not the lack of information but our limited capability to process that information. A point nicely illustrated by the fact that the celebrated advent of the internet age does not seem to have improved the quality of our decisions, judging by the mess we are in today. To put it another way, the world is full of uncertainty. Uncertainty here is not just not knowing exactly what is going to happen in the future. For certain things, we can reasonably calculate the probability of each possible contingency, even though we cannot predict the exact outcome. Economists call this risk. Indeed, our ability to calculate the risk involved in many aspects of human life, the likelihoods of death, disease, fire, injury, crop failure, and so on, is the very foundation of the insurance industry. However, for many other aspects of our life, we do not even know all the possible contingencies, not to speak of their respective likelihoods, as emphasized, among others, by the insightful American economist Frank Knight and the great British economist John Maynard Keynes in the early 20th century. Knight and Keynes argued that the kind of rational behavior that forms the foundation of much of modern economics is impossible under this kind of uncertainty. The best explanation of the concept of uncertainty, or the complexity of the world, to put it another way, was given by, perhaps surprisingly, Donald Rumsfeld, the defense secretary in the first government of George W. Bush. In a press briefing regarding the situation in Afghanistan in 2002, Rumsfeld opined, "There are known knowns. There are things we know that we know. There are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we now know we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. There are things we do not know we don't know. I don't think those at the plain English campaign that awarded the 2003 Foot and Mouth Award to the statement quite understood the significance of this statement for our understanding of human rationality. So what do we do, when the world is so complex and our ability to understand it so limited? Simon's answer was that we deliberately restrict our freedom of choice in order to reduce the range and the complexity of the problems that we have to deal with. This sounds esoteric, but when you think about it, this is exactly what we do all the time. Most of us create routines in our life so that we don't have to make too many decisions too often. The optimal amount of sleep and the optimal breakfast menu differ every day, depending on our physical conditions and the tasks ahead. Yet most of us go to bed at the same time, wake up at the same time and eat similar things for breakfast, at least during the weekdays. Simon's favorite example of how we need some rules in order to cope with our bounded rationality was chess. With only 32 pieces and 64 squares, chess may seem to be a relatively simple affair, but in fact involves a huge amount of calculation. If you were one of those hyper-rational beings, as Simon calls them, that populate standard economics textbooks, you would, of course, figure out all the possible moves and calculate their likelihoods before you make a move. But, Simon points out, there being around 10120, yes, that is 120 zeros, possibilities in an average game of chess, this rational approach requires mental capacity that no human being possesses. Indeed, studying chess masters, Simon realized that they use rules of thumb, heuristics, to focus on a small number of possible moves, in order to reduce the number of scenarios that need to be analyzed, even though the excluded moves may have brought better results. If chess is this complicated, you can imagine how complicated things are in our economy, which involves billions of people and millions of products. Therefore, in the same way in which individuals create routines in their daily lives or chess games, companies operate with productive routines, which simplify their options and search paths. They build certain decision-making structures, formal rules and conventions that automatically restrict the range of possible avenues that they explore, even when the avenues thus excluded outright may have been more profitable. But they still do it because otherwise they may drown in a sea of information and never make a decision. Similarly, societies create informal rules that deliberately restrict people's freedom of choice so that they don't have to make fresh choices constantly. So, they develop a convention for queuing so that people do not have to, for example, constantly calculate and recalculate their positions at a crowded bus stop in order to ensure that they get on the next bus. The government need not know better. So far so good, you may think, but what does Simon's theory of bounded rationality really have to say about regulation? Free market economists have argued against government regulation on the apparently reasonable ground that the government does not know better than those whose actions are regulated by it. By definition, the government cannot know someone's situation as well as the individual or firm concerned. Given this, they argue, it is impossible that government officials can improve upon the decisions made by the economic agents. However, Simon's theory shows that many regulations work not because the government necessarily knows better than the regulated, although it may sometimes do, see Thing 12, but because they limit the complexity of the activities, which enables the regulated to make better decisions. The 2008 world financial crisis illustrates this point very nicely. In the run-up to the crisis, our ability to make good decisions was simply overwhelmed because things were allowed to evolve in too complex a manner through financial innovation. So many complex financial instruments were created that even financial experts themselves did not fully understand them, unless they specialized in them, and sometimes not even then, see Thing 22. The top decision-makers of the financial firms certainly did not grasp much of what their businesses were doing. Nor could the regulatory authorities fully figure out what was going on. As discussed above, now we are seeing a flood of confessions, some voluntary, others forced, from the key decision-makers. If we are going to avoid similar financial crises in the future, we need to restrict severely freedom of action in the financial market. Financial instruments need to be banned unless we fully understand their workings and their effects on the rest of the financial sector and, moreover, the rest of the economy. This will mean banning many of the complex financial derivatives whose workings and impacts have been shown to be beyond the comprehension of even the supposed experts. You may think I am too extreme. However, this is what we do all the time with other products, drugs, cars, electrical products, and many others. When a company invents a new drug, for example, it cannot be sold immediately. The effects of a drug and the human body's reaction to it are complex. So the drug needs to be tested rigorously before we can be sure that it has enough beneficial effects that clearly overwhelm the side effects and allow it to be sold. There is nothing exceptional about proposing to ascertain the safety of financial products before they can be sold. Unless we deliberately restrict our choices by creating restrictive rules, thereby simplifying the environment that we have to deal with, our bounded rationality cannot cope with the complexity of the world. It is not because the government necessarily knows better that we need regulations. It is in the humble recognition of our limited mental capability that we do. Thing 17. More education in itself is not going to make a country richer. What they tell you. A well-educated workforce is absolutely necessary for economic development. The best proof of this is the contrast between the economic successes of the East Asian countries, with their famously high educational achievements, and the economic stagnation of sub-Saharan African countries, which have some of the lowest educational records in the world. Moreover, with the rise of the so-called knowledge economy, in which knowledge has become the main source of wealth, education, especially higher education, has become the absolute key to prosperity. What they don't tell you. There is remarkably little evidence showing that more education leads to greater national prosperity. Much of the knowledge gained in education is actually not relevant for productivity enhancement, even though it enables people to lead a more fulfilling and independent life. Also, the view that the rise of the knowledge economy has critically increased the importance of education is misleading. To begin with, the idea of the knowledge economy itself is problematic, as knowledge has always been the main source of wealth. Moreover, with increasing deindustrialization and mechanization, the knowledge requirements may even have fallen for most jobs in the rich countries. Even when it comes to higher education, which is supposed to matter more in the knowledge economy, there is no simple relationship between it and economic growth. What really matters in the determination of national prosperity is not the educational levels of individuals but the nation's ability to organize individuals into enterprises with high productivity. Education, 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 education. This is how the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair summed up his prospective government's top 3 policy priorities during the 1997 election campaign, which brought his new Labour Party to power after nearly 2 decades in the wilderness. The subsequent success or otherwise of New Labour's education policy may be disputed, but what is indisputable is that the comment perfectly captured Mr. Blair's exceptional ability to say the right thing at the right time. That is, before he lost his head over a rock. Many a politician before Mr. Blair had talked about and pushed for better education, but he was speaking at a time when, having witnessed the rise of the knowledge economy since the 1980s, the whole world was becoming convinced that education was the key to economic prosperity. If education had been important for economic success in the days of smokestack industries, more and more people were becoming convinced it would be the be-all and end-all in the information age, when brains, and not brawn, are the main source of wealth. The argument seems straightforward. More educated people are more productive, as evidenced by the higher salaries they get. So it is a matter of mathematical logic that an economy with more educated people will be more productive. The fact that poorer countries have a lower stock of educated people, or human capital, in some economists' jargon, also proves the point. The average duration of schooling is around 9 years in OECD countries, while it is not even 3 in sub-Saharan African countries. Also well known are the exceptionally high educational achievements of the miracle economies in East Asia, such as Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong and Singapore. Their educational achievements are manifested not just in quantitative terms such as high literacy rates or enrollment rates at various levels of education. The quality of their education is very high as well. They rank right at the top of the league in internationally standardized tests such as the Trends in International Mathematics and Science Study, TIMSS, for 4th and 8th graders, and the Program for International Student Assessment, PISA, which measures 15-year-olds' ability to apply maths knowledge to real-world problems. Need we say more? We don't need no education. Self-evident though the importance of education in raising an economy's productivity may seem, there is actually a lot of evidence that questions this piece of conventional wisdom. Let's first take the case of the East Asian miracle economies, in whose development education is supposed to have played a critical role. In 1960, Taiwan had a literacy rate of only 54%, while the Philippines was 72%. Despite its lower education level, Taiwan has since then notched up one of the best economic growth performances in human history, while the Philippines has done rather poorly. In 1960, the Philippines had almost double the per capita income of Taiwan, $200 versus $122, but today Taiwan's per capita income is around 10 times that of the Philippines, $18,000 versus $1,800. In the same year, Korea had a 71% literacy rate, comparable to that of the Philippines but still well below Argentina's 91%. Despite the significantly lower literacy rate, Korea has since grown much faster than Argentina. Korea's per capita income was just over one-fifth that of Argentina's in 1960, $82 versus $378. Today it is 3 times higher, around $21,000 versus around $7,000. Obviously, there are many more things than education that determine a country's economic growth performance. But these examples undermine the common myth that education was the key to the East Asian miracle. The East Asian economies did not have unusually high educational achievement at the start of their economic miracles, while countries like the Philippines and Argentina did very poorly despite having significantly better educated populations. At the other end of the spectrum, the experience of sub-Saharan Africa also shows that investing more in education is no guarantee of better economic performance. Between 1980 and 2004, literacy rates in sub-Saharan African countries rose quite substantially from 40% to 61%. Despite such rises, per capita income in the region actually fell by 0.3% per year during this period. If education is so important for economic development, as most of us believe, something like this should not happen. The apparent lack of positive effects of education on growth is not found only in the extreme cases that I have chosen, East Asia at one end and sub-Saharan Africa at the other. It is a more general phenomenon. In a widely cited 2004 article, Where Has All the Education Gone? Lant. Pritchett, a Harvard economist who worked at the World Bank for a long time, analyzed the data from dozens of rich and developing countries during the 1960 to 87 period and conducted an extensive review of similar studies, in order to establish whether education positively influences growth. His conclusion is that there is very little evidence to support the view that increased education leads to higher economic growth. Don't know much about history, don't know much biology. Why is there so little evidence to support what seems to be such an obvious proposition that more education should make a country richer? It is because, to put it simply, education is not as important in raising the productivity of an economy as we believe. To begin with, not all education is even meant to raise productivity. There are many subjects that have no impact, even indirectly, on most workers' productivity: literature, history, philosophy and music, for example, see Thing 3. From a strictly economic point of view, teaching these subjects is a waste of time. We teach our children those subjects because we believe that they will eventually enrich their lives and also make them good citizens. Even though this justification for educational spending is increasingly under attack in an age in which everything is supposed to justify its existence in terms of its contribution to productivity growth, it remains a very important, in my view, the most important, reason to invest in education. Moreover, even subjects like mathematics or sciences, which are supposed to be important for raising productivity, are not relevant for most workers. Investment bankers do not need biology or fashion designers' mathematics in order to be good at what they do. Even for those jobs for which these subjects are relevant, much of what you learn at school or even university is often not directly relevant for practical work. For example, the link between what a production line worker in a car factory learned in school physics and his productivity is rather tenuous. The importance of apprenticeship and on-the-job training in many professions testifies to the limited relevance of school education for worker productivity. So, even the supposedly productivity-oriented parts of education are not as relevant for raising productivity as we think. Cross-country statistical analyses have failed to find any relationship between a country's math scores and its economic performance. But let me give you more concrete examples. In the mathematical part of the 2007 TIMSS, U.S. fourth graders were behind not only the famously mathematical children of the East Asian countries but also their counterparts from countries such as Kazakhstan, Latvia, Russia and Lithuania. 4 children in all other rich European economies included in the test, except England and the Netherlands, scored lower than the U.S. children. 5 eighth graders from Norway, the richest country in the world, in terms of per capita income at market exchange rate, see Thing 10, were behind their counterparts not only in all other rich countries but also in much poorer countries, including Lithuania, Czech Republic, Slovenia, Armenia and Serbia. It is interesting to note that all these countries are former socialist countries. 6 eighth graders from Israel, a country famous for its educational zeal and exceptional performance in high-end research, scored behind Norway, falling behind Bulgaria as well. Similar stories were observed in science tests. How about the knowledge economy? Even if education's impact on growth has been meager so far, you may wonder whether the recent rise of the knowledge economy may have changed all that. With ideas becoming the main source of wealth, it may be argued, education will from now on become much more important in determining a country's prosperity. Against this, I must first of all point out that the knowledge economy is nothing new. We have always lived in one in the sense that it has always been a country's command over knowledge, or lack of it, that made it rich, or poor. China was the richest country in the world during the first millennium because it possessed technical knowledge that others did not: paper, movable type, gunpowder and the compass being the most famous, but by no means the only, examples. Britain became the world's economic hegemon in the 19th century because it came to lead the world in technological innovation. When Germany became as poor as Peru and Mexico right after the Second World War, no one suggested that it should be reclassified as a developing country, because people knew that it still had command over technological, organizational and institutional knowledge that had made it one of the most formidable industrial powers before the war. In that sense, the importance, or otherwise, of education has not changed in the recent period. Of course, the knowledge stock that the humanity collectively commands today is much bigger than in the past, but that does not mean that everyone, or even the majority of the people, has to be better educated than in the past. If anything, the amount of productivity-related knowledge that an average worker needs to possess has fallen for many jobs, especially in rich countries. This may sound absurd, but let me explain. To begin with the continuous rise in manufacturing productivity, a greater proportion of the workforce in rich countries now works in low-skilled service jobs that do not require much education, stacking shelves in supermarkets, frying burgers in fast food restaurants and cleaning offices, see things 3 and 9. Insofar as the proportion of people in such professions increases, we may actually do with an increasingly less, not more, educated labor force, if we are only interested in the productivity effects of education. Moreover, with economic development, a higher proportion of knowledge becomes embodied in machines. This means that the economy-wide productivity increases despite individual workers having less understanding of what they do than their counterparts in the past. For the most striking example, these days most shop assistants in rich countries do not even need to know how to add, a skill that their counterparts in earlier times definitely needed, as barcode machines do that for them. For another example, blacksmiths in poor countries probably know more about the nature of metals in relation to tool making than do most employees of Bosch or Black & Decker. For yet another example, those who work at the small electronics shops littering the streets of poor countries can fix many more things than can individual workers at Samsung or Sony. A large part of this is due to the simple fact that mechanization is the most important way to increase productivity. But an influential Marxist school of thought argues that capitalists deliberately de-skill their workers by using the most mechanized production technologies possible, even if they are not the most economical, in order to make the workers more easily replaceable and thus easier to control. 7. Whatever the exact cause of the mechanization process, the upshot is that more technologically developed economies may actually need fewer educated people. The Swiss paradox. Now, it may be argued that, even though economic development may not necessarily require the average worker to be more educated, it needs more educated people at the higher end. After all, as I have pointed out above, the ability to generate more productive knowledge than others is what makes a country richer than others. Thus seen, it may be argued, it is the quality of universities, rather than that of primary schools, that determines a nation's prosperity. However, even in this supposedly knowledge-driven era, the relationship between higher education and prosperity is not straightforward. Let us take the striking example of Switzerland. The country is one of the top few richest and most industrialized countries in the world, see things 9 and 10, but it has, surprisingly, the lowest, actually by far the lowest, university enrollment rate in the rich world. Until the early 1990s, only around 1/3 of the average for other rich countries. Until as late as 1996, the Swiss university enrollment rate was still less than half the OECD average, 16% versus 34%. 0.8 Since then, Switzerland increased its rate considerably, bringing it up to 47% by 2007, according to UNESCO data. However, the Swiss rate still remains the lowest in the rich world and is way below what we find in the most university-heavy countries, such as Finland, 94%, the US, 82%, and Denmark, 80%. It is, interestingly, also far lower than that of many considerably poorer economies, such as Korea, 96%, Greece, 91%, Lithuania, 76%, and Argentina, 68%. How is it possible that Switzerland has stayed at the very top of the International Productivity League despite providing much less higher education than not just its main competitors but also many economies that are much poorer? One possible explanation is that universities in different countries have different qualities. So, if Korean or Lithuanian universities are not as good as Swiss universities, it may be possible for Switzerland to be richer than Korea or Lithuania, even if a much lower proportion of the Swiss have university education than do the Koreans or the Lithuanians. However, this argument loses much of its force when we compare Switzerland with Finland or the US. We cannot in all seriousness suggest that Swiss universities are so much better than Finnish or American ones that Switzerland can get away with university enrollment rates half theirs. The main explanation for the Swiss paradox should be found, once again, in the low productivity content of education. However, in the case of higher education, the non-productivity component is not so much about teaching people subjects that will help them with things such as personal fulfillment, good citizenship and national identity, as in the case of primary and secondary education. It is about what economists call the sorting function. Higher education, of course, imparts certain productivity-related knowledge to its recipients, but another important function of it is to establish each individual's ranking in the hierarchy of employability. Point 9. In many lines of work, what counts is general intelligence, discipline and the ability to organize oneself, rather than specialist knowledge, much of which you can, and have to, actually pick up on the job. So, even if what you learn in a university as a history major or a chemist may not be relevant to your work as a prospective manager in an insurance company or as a government official in the Department of Transport, the fact that you have graduated from a university tells your potential employers that you are likely to be smarter, more self-disciplined and better organized than those who have not. By hiring you as a university graduate, your employer is then hiring you for those general qualities, not for your specialist knowledge, which is often irrelevant to the job you will be performing. Now, with the increasing emphasis on higher education in the recent period, an unhealthy dynamic has been established for higher education in many high-income and upper-middle-income countries that can afford to expand universities. Switzerland has not been immune to this, as figures above suggest. Once the proportion of people going to university goes over a critical threshold, people have to go to university in order to get a decent job. When, say, 50% of the population goes to university, not going to university is implicitly declaring that you are in the bottom half of the ability distribution, which is not the greatest way to start your job search. So, people go to university, fully knowing that they will waste time studying things that they will never need for their work. With everyone wanting to go to university, the demand for higher education increases, which then leads to the supply of more university places, which raises university enrollment rate further, increasing the pressure to go to university even more. Over time, this leads to a process of degree inflation. Now that everyone has a university degree, you have to do a master's or even a PhD in order to stand out, even if the productivity content of those further degrees may be minimal for your future jobs. Given that Switzerland was until the mid-1990s able to maintain one of the highest national productivities in the world with a university enrollment of 10 to 15%, we could say that enrollment rates much higher than that are really unnecessary. Even if we accept that skills requirement has risen so much with the rise of the knowledge economy that the 40+% enrollment rate that Switzerland now has is the minimum, which I seriously doubt, this still means that at least half of university education in countries such as the US, Korea and Finland is wasted in the essentially zero-sum game of sorting. The higher education system in these countries has become like a theater in which some people decided to stand to get a better view, prompting others behind them to stand. Once enough people stand, everyone has to stand, which means that no one is getting a better view, while everyone has become more uncomfortable. Education versus enterprise. If not just basic education but also higher education does not matter so much in determining a nation's prosperity, we must seriously rethink the role of education in our economy. In the case of rich countries, their obsession with higher education has to be tamed. This obsession has led to unhealthy degree inflation and the consequent overinvestment of huge scale in higher education in many countries. I am not against countries having a very high, or even 100%, university enrollment rate for other reasons, but they should not delude themselves into believing that it would have a significant productivity effect. In the case of developing countries, an even more radical change of perspective is needed. While they should expand education in order to prepare their youngsters for a more meaningful life, when it comes to the question of productivity increase, these countries need to look beyond the education of individuals and pay more attention to building the right institutions and organizations for productivity growth. What really distinguishes the rich countries from the poorer ones is much less how well educated their individual citizens are than how well their citizens are organized into collective entities with high productivity, be that giant firms such as Boeing or Volkswagen or the smaller world-class firms of Switzerland and Italy, see Thing 15. Development of such firms needs to be supported by a range of institutions that encourage investment and risk-taking, a trade regime that protects and nurtures firms in infant industries, see Things 7 and 12, a financial system that provides patient capital necessary for long-term productivity-enhancing investments, see Thing 2, institutions that provide second chances for both the capitalists, a good bankruptcy law, and for the workers, a good welfare state, see Thing 21, public subsidies and regulation regarding R&D and training, see Things 18 and 19, and so on. Education is valuable, but its main value is not in raising productivity. It lies in its ability to help us develop our potentials and live a more fulfilling and independent life. If we expanded education in the belief that it will make our economies richer, we will be sorely disappointed, for the link between education and national productivity is rather tenuous and complicated. Our overenthusiasm with education should be tamed, and, especially in developing countries, far greater attention needs to be paid to the issue of establishing and upgrading productive enterprises and institutions that support them. Thing 18. What is good for General Motors is not necessarily good for the United States. What they tell you. At the heart of the capitalist system is the corporate sector. This is where things are produced, jobs created and new technologies invented. Without a vibrant corporate sector, there is no economic dynamism. What is good for business, therefore, is good for the national economy. Especially given the increasing international competition in a globalizing world, countries that make opening and running businesses difficult or make firms do unwanted things will lose investment and jobs, eventually falling behind. Government needs to give the maximum degree of freedom to business. What they don't tell you. Despite the importance of the corporate sector, allowing firms the maximum degree of freedom may not even be good for the firms themselves, let alone the national economy. In fact, not all regulations are bad for business. Sometimes, it is in the long-run interest of the business sector to restrict the freedom of individual firms so that they do not destroy the common pool of resources that all of them need, such as natural resources or the labor force. Regulations can also help businesses by making them do things that may be costly to them individually in the short run but raise their collective productivity in the long run, such as the provision of worker training. In the end, what matters is not the quantity but the quality of business regulation. How Detroit won the war. They say that Detroit won the Second World War. Yes, the Soviet Union sacrificed the most people. The estimated death toll in the Great Patriotic War, as it is known in Russia, was upward of 25 million, nearly half of all deaths worldwide. But it, and, of course, the UK, would not have survived the Nazi offensive without the arms sent over from what Franklin Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy, that is, the United States. And most of those arms were made in the converted factories of the Detroit carmakers, General Motors, GM, Ford and Chrysler. So, without the industrial might of the US, represented by Detroit, the Nazis would have taken over Europe and at least the western part of the Soviet Union. Of course, history is never straightforward. What made the early success of Nazi Germany in the war possible was the ability of its army to move quickly, its famous Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. And what made that high mobility of the German army possible was its high degree of motorization, many technologies for which were supplied by none other than GM, through its Opel subsidiary, acquired in 1929. Moreover, evidence is emerging that, in defiance of the law, throughout the war GM secretly maintained its link with Opel, which built not only military cars but aircraft, landmines and torpedoes. So it seems that GM was arming both sides and profiting from it. Even among the Detroit carmakers, collectively known as the Big Three, GM by then stood preeminent. Under the leadership of Alfred Sloan Jr., who ran it for 35 years, 1923 to 58, GM had overtaken Ford as the largest U.S. carmaker by the late 1920s and gone on to become the all-American automobile company, producing, in Sloan's words, a car for every purse and purpose, arranged along a ladder of success, starting with Chevrolet, moving up through Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick and finally culminating in Cadillac. By the end of the Second World War, GM was not just the biggest carmaker in the U.S., it had become the biggest company in the country, in terms of revenue. It was so important that, when asked in the congressional hearing for his appointment as U.S. Defense Secretary in 1953 whether he saw any potential conflict between his corporate background and his public duties, Mr. Charlie Wilson, who used to be the CEO of General Motors, famously replied that what is good for the United States is good for General Motors and vice versa. The logic behind this argument seems difficult to dispute. In a capitalist economy, private sector companies play the central role in creating wealth, jobs and tax revenue. If they do well, the whole economy does well by extension. Especially when the enterprise in question is one of the largest and technologically most dynamic enterprises, like GM in the 1950s, its success or otherwise has significant effects on the rest of the economy, the supplier firms, the employees of those firms, the producers of goods that the giant firm's employees, who can number in the hundreds of thousands, may buy, and so on. Therefore, how these giant firms do is particularly important for the prosperity of the national economy. Unfortunately, proponents of this logic say, this obvious argument was not widely accepted during much of the 20th century. One can understand why communist regimes were against the private sector. After all, they believed that private property was the source of all the evils of capitalism. However, between the Great Depression and the 1970s, private business was viewed with suspicion even in most capitalist economies. Businesses were, so the story goes, seen as anti-social agents whose profit-seeking needed to be restrained for other, supposedly loftier, goals, such as justice, social harmony, protection of the weak and even national glory. As a result, complicated and cumbersome systems of licensing were introduced in the belief that governments need to regulate which firms do what in the interest of wider society. In some countries, governments even pushed firms into unwanted businesses in the name of national development, see things 7 and 12. Large firms were banned from entering those segments of the market populated by small farms, factories and retail shops, in order to preserve the traditional way of life and protect small men against big business. Onerous labor regulations were introduced in the name of protecting worker rights. In many countries, consumer rights were extended to such a degree that it hurt business. These regulations, pro-business commentators argue, not only harmed the large firms but made everyone else worse off by reducing the overall size of the pie to be shared out. By limiting the ability of firms to experiment with new ways of doing business and enter new areas, these regulations slowed down the growth of overall productivity. In the end, however, the folly of this anti-business logic became too obvious, the argument goes. As a result, since the 1970s, countries from all around the world have come to accept that what is good for business is good for the national economy and have adopted a pro-business policy stance. Even communist countries have given up their attempts to stifle the private sector since the 1990s. Need we ponder upon this issue anymore? How the mighty has fallen. 5 decades after Mr. Wilson's remark, in the summer of 2009, GM went bankrupt. Notwithstanding its well-known aversion to state ownership, the U.S. government took over the company and, after an extensive restructuring, launched it as a new entity. In the process, it spent a staggering $57.6 billion of taxpayers' money. It may be argued that the rescue was in the American national interest. Letting a company of GM's size and interlinkages collapse suddenly would have had huge negative ripple effects on jobs and demand, e.g., fall in consumer demand from unemployed GM workers, evaporation of GM's demand for products from its supplier firms, aggravating the financial crisis that was unfolding in the country at the time. The U.S. government chose the lesser of the two evils on behalf of the taxpayers. What was good for GM was still good for the United States, it may be argued, even though it was not a very good thing in absolute terms. However, that does not mean that we should not question how GM got into that situation in the first place. When faced with stiff competition from imports from Germany, Japan and then Korea from the 1960s, GM did not respond in the most natural, if difficult, way it should have, producing better cars than those of its competitors. Instead, it tried to take the easy way out. First, it blamed dumping and other unfair trade practices by its competitors and got the U.S. government to impose import quotas on foreign, especially Japanese, cars and force open competitors' home markets. In the 1990s, when these measures proved insufficient to halt its decline, it had tried to make up for its failings in car making by developing its financial arm, GMAC, General Motors Acceptance Corporation. GMAC moved beyond its traditional function of financing car purchases and started conducting financial transactions for their own sake. GMAC itself proved quite successful. In 2004, for example, 80% of GM's profit came from GMAC. See Thing 22.1, but that could not really hide the fundamental problem, that the company could not make good cars at competitive prices. Around the same time, the company tried to shortcut the need for investing in the development of better technologies by buying up smaller foreign competitors, such as Saab of Sweden and Daewoo of Korea, but these were nowhere near enough to revive the company's former technological superiority. In other words, in the last 4 decades, GM has tried everything to halt its decline except making better cars because trying to make better cars itself was, well, too much trouble. Obviously, all these decisions may have been best from GM's point of view at the time when they were made. After all, they allowed the company to survive for a few more decades with the least effort, but they have not been good for the rest of the United States. The huge bill that American taxpayers have been landed with through the rescue package is the ultimate proof of that, but along the way, the rest of the US could have done better, had GM been forced to invest in the technologies and machines needed to build better cars, instead of lobbying for protection, buying up smaller competitors and turning itself into a financial company. More importantly, all those actions that have enabled GM to get out of difficulties with the least effort have ultimately not been good even for GM itself, unless you equate GM with its managers and a constantly changing group of shareholders. These managers drew absurdly high salaries by delivering higher profits by not investing for productivity growth while squeezing other weaker stakeholders, their workers, supplier firms and the employees of those firms. They bought the acquiescence of shareholders by offering them dividends and share buybacks to such an extent that the company's future was jeopardized. The shareholders did not mind, and indeed many of them encouraged such practices, because most of them were floating shareholders who were not really concerned with the long-term future of the company because they could leave at a moment's notice. See Thing 2. The story of GM teaches us some salutary lessons about the potential conflicts between corporate and national interests. What is good for a company, however important it may be, may not be good for the country. Moreover, it highlights the conflicts between different stakeholders that make up the firm. What is good for some stakeholders of a company, such as managers and short-term shareholders, may not be good for others, such as workers and suppliers. Ultimately, it also tells us that what is good for a company in the short run may not even be good for it in the long run. What is good for GM today may not be good for GM tomorrow. Now, some readers, even ones who were already persuaded by this argument, may still wonder whether the US is just an exception that proves the rule. Under-regulation may be a problem for the US, but in most other countries, isn't the problem over-regulation? 299 permits. In the early 1990s, the Hong Kong-based English-language business magazine, Far Eastern Economic Review, ran a special issue on South Korea. In one article, the magazine expressed puzzlement at the fact that, even though it needed up to 299 permits from up to 199 agencies to open a factory in the country, South Korea had grown at over 6% in per capita terms for the previous 3 decades. How was this possible? How can a country with such an oppressive regulatory regime grow so fast? Before trying to make sense of this puzzle, I must point out that it was not just Korea before the 1990s in which seemingly onerous regulations coexisted with a vibrant economy. The situation was similar in Japan and Taiwan throughout their miracle years between the 1950s and the 1980s. The Chinese economy has been heavily regulated in a similar manner during the last 3 decades of rapid growth. In contrast, over the last 3 decades, many developing countries in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa have deregulated their economies in the hope that it would stimulate business activities and accelerate their growth. However, puzzlingly, since the 1980s, they have grown far more slowly than in the 1960s and 70s, when they were supposedly held back by excessive regulations, see things 7 and 11. The first explanation for the puzzle is that, strange as it may seem to most people without business experience, business people will get 299 permits, with some circumvented along the way with bribes, if they can get away with it, if there is enough money to be made at the end of the process. So, in a country that is growing fast and where good business opportunities are cropping up all the time, even the hassle of acquiring 299 permits would not deter business people from opening a new line of business. In contrast, if there is little money to be made at the end of the process, even 29 permits may look too onerous. More importantly, the reason why some countries that have heavily regulated business have done economically well is that many regulations are actually good for business. Sometimes regulations help business by limiting the ability of firms to engage in activities that bring them greater profits in the short run but ultimately destroy the common resource that all business firms need. For example, regulating the intensity of fish farming may reduce the profits of individual fish farms but help the fish farming industry as a whole by preserving the quality of water that all the fish farms have to use. For another example, it may be in the interest of individual firms to employ children and lower their wage bills. However, a widespread use of child labor will lower the quality of the labor force in the longer run by stunting the physical and mental development of children. In such a case, child labor regulation can actually benefit the entire business sector in the long run. For yet another example, individual banks may benefit from lending more aggressively. But when all of them do the same, they may all suffer in the end, as such lending behaviors may increase the chance of systemic collapse, as we have seen in the 2008 global financial crisis. Restricting what banks can do, then, may actually help them in the long run, even if it does not immediately benefit them, see Thing 22. It is not just that regulation can help firms by preventing them from undermining the basis of their long-term sustainability. Sometimes, regulations can help businesses by forcing firms to do things that may not be in their individual interests but raise their collective productivity in the long run. For example, firms often do not invest enough in training their workers. This is because they are worried about their workers being poached by other firms, free riding on their training efforts. In such a situation, the government imposing a requirement for worker training on all firms could actually raise the quality of the labor force, thereby ultimately benefiting all firms. For another example, in a developing country that needs to import technologies from abroad, the government can help business achieve higher productivity in the long run by banning the importation of overly obsolete foreign technologies that may enable their importers to undermine competitors in the short run but will lock them into dead-end technologies. Karl Marx described the government restriction of business freedom for the sake of the collective interest of the capitalist class as it acting as the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. But you don't need to be a Marxist to see that regulations restricting freedom for individual firms may promote the collective interest of the entire business sector, not to speak of the nation as a whole. In other words, there are many regulations that are pro rather than anti-business. Many regulations help preserve the common pool resources that all firms share, while others help business by making firms do things that raise their collective productivity in the long run. Only when we recognize this will we be able to see that what matters is not the absolute amount of regulation, but the aims and contents of those regulations. Thing 19. Despite the fall of communism, we are still living in planned economies. What they tell you. The limits of economic planning have been resoundingly demonstrated by the fall of communism. In complex modern economies, planning is neither possible nor desirable. Only decentralized decisions through the market mechanism, based on individuals and firms being always on the lookout for a profitable opportunity, are capable of sustaining a complex modern economy. We should do away with the delusion that we can plan anything in this complex and ever-changing world. The less planning there is, the better. What they don't tell you. Capitalist economies are in large part planned. Governments in capitalist economies practice planning too, albeit on a more limited basis than under communist central planning. All of them finance a significant share of investment in R&D and infrastructure. Most of them plan a significant chunk of the economy through the planning of the activities of state-owned enterprises. Many capitalist governments plan the future shape of individual industrial sectors through sectoral industrial policy or even that of the national economy through indicative planning. More importantly, modern capitalist economies are made up of large, hierarchical corporations that plan their activities in great detail, even across national borders. Therefore, the question is not whether you plan or not. It is about planning the right things at the right levels. Upper Volta with rockets. In the 1970s, many Western diplomats called the Soviet Union Upper Volta with rockets. What an insult, that is, to Upper Volta, renamed Burkina Faso in 1984, which was being branded the quintessential poor country when it wasn't even near the bottom of the World Poverty League. The nickname, however, succinctly summarized what was wrong with the Soviet economy. Here was a country that could send men into space but had people queuing up for basic foodstuffs such as bread and sugar. The country had no problem churning out intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear submarines, but could not manufacture a decent TV. It is reported that in the 1980s the second biggest cause of fires in Moscow was, believe it or not, exploding TVs. The top Russian scientists were as inventive as their counterparts in capitalist countries, but the rest of the country did not seem able to live up to the same standard. What was going on? In pursuit of the communist vision of a classless society based on collective ownership of the means of production, e.g., machines, factory buildings, roads, the Soviet Union and its communist allies aimed for full employment and a high degree of equality. Since no one was allowed to own any means of production, virtually all enterprises were run by professional managers, with minor exceptions such as small restaurants and hairdressers, preventing the emergence of visionary entrepreneurs, like Henry Ford or Bill Gates. Given the political commitment to high equality, there was a clear cap on how much a business manager, however successful, could get. This meant that there was only a limited incentive for business managers to turn the advanced technologies that the system was clearly capable of producing into products that consumers actually wanted. The policy of full employment at all costs meant that managers could not use the ultimate threat, that of sacking, to discipline workers. This contributed to sloppy work and absenteeism. When he was trying to reform the Soviet economy, Gorbachev frequently spoke of the problem of labor discipline. Of course, all this did not mean that no one in communist countries was motivated to work hard or to run a good business. Even in capitalist economies, we don't do things just for the money, see Thing 5, but communist countries relied, with some success, much more on the less selfish sides of human nature. Especially in the early days of communism. There was a lot of idealism about building a new society. In the Soviet Union, there was also a huge surge of patriotism during and shortly after the Second World War. In all communist countries there were many dedicated managers and workers who did things well out of professionalism and self-respect. Moreover, by the 1960s, the ideal egalitarianism of early communism had given way to realism and performance-related pay had become the norm, mitigating, although by no means eliminating, the incentive problem. Despite this, the system still failed to function well because of the inefficiency of the communist central planning system, which was supposed to be a more efficient alternative to the market system. The communist justification of central planning was based on some quite sound logic. Karl Marx and his followers argued that the fundamental problem with capitalism was the contradiction between the social nature of the production process and the private nature of ownership of the means of production. With economic development, or the development of productive forces, in Marxist jargon, the division of labor between firms develops further and as a result the firms become increasingly more dependent on each other, or the social nature of the production process is intensified. However, despite the growing interdependence among firms, the Marxists argued, ownership of the firms firmly remains in separate private hands, making it impossible to coordinate the actions of those interdependent firms. Of course, price changes ensure that there is some ex-post coordination of firm decisions, but its extent is limited in the imbalance between demand and supply, created by such, in non-Marxist terms, coordination failures, accumulates into periodic economic crises. During an economic crisis, the argument went, a lot of valuable resources are wasted. Many unsold products are thrown away, machines that used to produce now unwanted things are scrapped, and workers who are capable and willing to work are laid off due to the lack of demand. With the development of capitalism, the Marxists predicted, this systemic contradiction would become larger and consequently economic crises would become more and more violent, finally bringing the whole system down. In contrast, under central planning, the Marxists argued, all means of production are owned by the whole of society and as a result the activities of interdependent production units can be coordinated ex ante through a unified plan. As any potential coordination failure is resolved before it happens, the economy does not have to go through those periodic crises in order to balance supply and demand. Under central planning, the economy will produce only exactly what is needed. No resource will lie idle at any time, since there will be no economic crisis. Therefore, the central planning system, it was argued, will manage the economy much more efficiently than the market system. That, at least, was the theory. Unfortunately, central planning did not work very well in practice. The main problem was that of complexity. The Marxists may have been right in thinking that the development in productive forces, by increasing interdependence among different segments of capital, makes it more necessary to plan centrally. However, they failed to recognize that it also makes the economy more complex, making it more difficult to plan centrally. Central planning worked well when the targets were relatively simple and clear, as seen in the success of early Soviet industrialization, where the main task was to produce a relatively small number of key products in large quantities: steel, tractors, wheat, potatoes, etc. However, as the economy developed, central planning became increasingly difficult, with a growing number of actual and potential diverse products. Of course, with economic development, the ability to plan also increased thanks to improvements in managerial skills, mathematical techniques of planning, and computers. However, the increase in the ability to plan was not sufficient to deal with the increase in the complexity of the economy. One obvious solution was to limit the variety of products, but that created huge consumer dissatisfaction. Moreover, even with reduced varieties, the economy was still too complex to plan. Many unwanted things were produced and remained unsold, while there were shortages of other things, resulting in the ubiquitous queues. By the time communism started unraveling in the 1980s, there was so much cynicism about the system that was increasingly incapable of delivering its promises that the joke was that in the communist countries, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. No wonder central planning was abandoned across the board when the ruling communist parties were ousted across the Soviet bloc, following the fall of the Berlin Wall. Even countries such as China and Vietnam, which ostensibly maintained communism, have gradually abandoned central planning, although their states still hold high degrees of control over the economy. So, we all now live in market economies, well, unless you live in North Korea or Cuba. Planning is gone. Or is it? There is planning and there is planning. The fact that communism has disappeared for all practical purposes does not mean that planning has ceased to exist. Governments in capitalist economies also plan, albeit not in the same comprehensive way that the central planning authorities in communist countries did. Even in a capitalist economy, there are situations, a war, for example, in which central planning is more effective. For example, during the Second World War, the economies of the major capitalist belligerents, the US, the UK and Germany, were all centrally planned in everything but name. But more importantly, many capitalist countries have successfully used what is known as indicative planning. This is planning that involves the government in a capitalist country setting some broad targets concerning key economic variables, e.g., investments in strategic industries, infrastructure development, exports, and working with, not against, the private sector to achieve them. Unlike under central planning, these targets are not legally binding, hence the adjective, indicative. However, the government will do its best to achieve them by mobilizing various carrots, e.g., subsidies, granting of monopoly rights, and sticks, e.g., regulations, influence through state-owned banks, at its disposal. France had great success in promoting investment and technological innovation through indicative planning in the 1950s and 60s, thereby overtaking the British economy as Europe's second industrial power. Other European countries, such as Finland, Norway and Austria, also successfully used indicative planning to upgrade their economies between the 1950s and the 1970s. The East Asian miracle economies of Japan, Korea and Taiwan used indicative planning too between the 1950s and the 1980s. This is not to say that all indicative planning exercises have been successful. In India, for example, it has not. Nevertheless, the European and East Asian examples show that planning in certain forms is not incompatible with capitalism and may even promote capitalist development very well. Moreover, even when they do not explicitly plan the entire economy, even in an indicative way, governments in most capitalist economies make and implement plans for certain key activities, which can have economy-wide implications, see Thing 12. Most capitalist governments plan and shape the future of some key industries through what is known as sectoral industrial policy. The European and East Asian countries which practiced indicative planning all also practiced active sectoral industrial policy. Even countries that have not practiced indicative planning, such as Sweden and Germany, have practiced sectoral industrial policy. In most capitalist countries, the government owns, and often also operates, a sizable chunk of the national economy through state-owned enterprises, SOEs. SOEs are frequently found in the key infrastructure sectors, e.g., railways, roads, ports, airports, or essential services, e.g., water, electricity, postal service, but also exist in manufacturing or finance. More stories about SOEs can be found in the chapter, Man Exploits Man, of my book Bad Samaritans. The share of SOs in national output could be as high as 20% plus, in the case of Singapore, or as low as 1%, in the case of the US, but the international average is around 10%. As the government plans the activities of SOs, this means that a significant part of the average capitalist economy is directly planned. When we consider the fact that SOs usually operate in sectors with disproportionate impacts on the rest of the economy, the indirect effect of planning through SOs is even greater than what is suggested by the share of SOs in national output. Moreover, in all capitalist economies, the government plans the national technological future by funding a very high proportion, 20 to 50%, of research and development. Interestingly, the US is one of the most planned capitalist economies in this regard. Between the 1950s and the 1980s, the share of government funding in total R&D in the supposedly free market US accounted for, depending on the year, between 47% and 65%, as against around 20% in Japan and Korea and less than 40% in several European countries, e.g., Belgium, Finland, Germany, Sweden. 0.1 The ratio has come down since the 1990s, as military R&D funding was reduced with the end of the Cold War. However, even so, the share of government in R&D in the US is still higher than in many other capitalist economies. It is notable that most of the industries where the US has an international technological lead are the industries that have been receiving major government R&D funding through military programs, e.g., computers, semiconductors, aircraft, and health projects, e.g., pharmaceuticals, biotechnology. Of course, since the 1980s the extent of government planning in most capitalist economies has declined, not least because of the rise of pro-market ideology during this period. Indicative planning has been phased out in most countries, including in the ones where it had been successful. In many, although not all, countries, privatization has resulted in a falling share of SOs in national output and investment. The share of government funding in total R&D funding has also fallen in virtually all capitalist countries, although not by very much in most cases. However, I would argue, despite the relative decline of government planning in the recent period, there is still extensive, and increasing, planning in the capitalist economies. Why do I say that? To plan or not to plan? That is not the question. Suppose that a new CEO arrived in a company and said, "I am a great believer in market forces. In this fast-changing world, we should not have a fixed strategy and should maintain maximum possible flexibility. So, from now on, everyone in this company is going to be guided by ever-changing market prices, and not by some rigid plan." What do you think would happen? Would his employees welcome a leader with a vision fit for the 21st century? Would the shareholders applaud his market-friendly approach and award him with a pay rise? He wouldn't last a week. People would say he does not have leadership qualities. He would be accused of lacking the vision thing, as George Bush Sr. once put it. The top decision maker, it would be pointed out, should be willing to shape the future of the company, rather than letting it just happen. Blindly following market signals, they would say, is not how you run a business. People would expect a new CEO to say something like, "This is where our company is today. That is where I want to take it in 10 years' time. In order to get there, we will develop new industries A, B and C, while winding down D and E. Our subsidiary in Industry D will be sold off. We will shut down our subsidiary in Industry E at home, but some production may be shifted to China. In order to develop our subsidiary in Industry A, we will have to cross-subsidize it with the profits from existing businesses. In order to establish a presence in Industry B, we have to go into strategic alliance with Keisha Corporation of Japan, which may involve supplying it with some inputs that we produce at below market prices. In order to expand our business in Industry C, we will need to increase our R&D investment in the next 5 years. All this may mean the company as a whole making losses in the foreseeable future. If that is the case, so be it. Because that is the price we have to pay in order to have a brighter future. In other words, a CEO is expected to be a man, or a woman, with a plan. Businesses plan their activities, often down to the last detail. Indeed, that is where Marx got the idea of centrally planning the whole economy. When he talked about planning, there was in fact no real-life government that was practicing planning. At the time, only firms planned. What Marx predicted was that the rational planning approach of the capitalist firms would eventually prove superior to the wasteful anarchy of the market and thus eventually be extended to the whole economy. To be sure, he criticized planning within the firm as despotism by capitalists, but he believed that, once private property was abolished and the capitalists eliminated, the rational elements of such despotism could be isolated and harnessed for the social good. With the development of capitalism, more and more areas of the economy have become dominated by large corporations. This means that the area of the capitalist economy that is covered by planning has in fact grown. To give you a concrete example, these days, depending on the estimate, between 1/3 and 1/2 of international trade consists of transfers among different units within transnational corporations. Herbert Simon, the 1978 Nobel laureate in economics who was a pioneer of the study of business organizations, see Thing 16, put this point succinctly in 1991 in Organizations and Markets, one of the last articles he wrote. If a Martian, with no preconceptions, came to Earth and observed our economy, Simon mused, would he conclude that Earthlings live in a market economy? No, Simon said, he would almost certainly have concluded that Earthlings live in an organizational economy in the sense that the bulk of Earth's economic activities is coordinated within the boundaries of firms, organizations, rather than through market transactions between those firms. If firms were represented by green and markets by red, Simon argued, the Martian would see large green areas interconnected by red lines, rather than a network of red lines connecting green spots. Point 2, and we think planning is dead. Simon did not talk much about government planning, but if we add government planning, modern capitalist economies are even more planned than his Martian example suggests. Between the planning that is going on within corporations and various types of planning by the government, modern capitalist economies are planned to a very high degree. One interesting point that follows from these observations is that rich countries are more planned than poor countries, owing to the more widespread existence of large corporations and often more pervasive, albeit often less visible, on account of its more subtle approach, presence of the government. The question, then, is not whether to plan or not. It is what the appropriate levels and forms of planning are for different activities. The prejudice against planning, while understandable given the failures of communist central planning, makes us misunderstand the true nature of the modern economy in which government policy, corporate planning and market relationships are all vital and interact in a complex way. Without markets we will end up with the inefficiencies of the Soviet system. However, thinking that we can live by the market alone is like believing that we can live by eating only salt, because salt is vital for our survival. Thing 20. Equality of opportunity may not be fair. What they tell you. Many people get upset by inequality. However, there is equality and there is equality. When you reward people the same way regardless of their efforts and achievements, the more talented and the harder working lose the incentive to perform. This is equality of outcome. It's a bad idea, as proven by the fall of communism. The equality we seek should be the equality of opportunity. For example, it was not only unjust but also inefficient for a black student in apartheid South Africa not to be able to go to better, white, universities, even if he was a better student. People should be given equal opportunities. However, it is equally unjust and inefficient to introduce affirmative action and begin to admit students of lower quality simply because they are black or from a deprived background. In trying to equalize outcomes, we not only misallocate talents but also penalize those who have the best talent and make the greatest efforts. What they don't tell you. Equality of opportunity is the starting point for a fair society. But it's not enough. Of course, individuals should be rewarded for better performance, but the question is whether they are actually competing under the same conditions as their competitors. If a child does not perform well in school because he is hungry and cannot concentrate in class, it cannot be said that the child does not do well because he is inherently less capable. Fair competition can be achieved only when the child is given enough food, at home through family income support and at school through a free school meals program. Unless there is some equality of outcome, i.e., the incomes of all the parents are above a certain minimum threshold, allowing their children not to go hungry, equal opportunities, i.e., free schooling, are not truly meaningful. More Catholic than the Pope? In Latin America, people frequently use the expression that someone is more Catholic than the Pope, más papista que el Papa. This refers to the tendency of societies in the intellectual periphery to apply doctrines, religious, economic and social, more rigidly than do their source countries. Koreans, my own people, are probably the world champions at being more Catholic than the Pope, not quite in a literal sense. Only around 10% of them are Catholics. Korea is not exactly a small country. The combined population of North and South Koreas, which for nearly a millennium until 1945 used to be one country, is about 70 million today. But it happens to be bang in the middle of a zone where the interests of the giants, China, Japan, Russia and the US, clash. So we have become very adept at adopting the ideology of one of the big boys and being more orthodox about it than he is. When we do communism, up in North Korea, we are more communist than the Russians. When we practiced Japanese-style state capitalism, in the South, between the 1960s and the 1980s, we were more state capitalist than the Japanese. Now that we have switched over to US-style capitalism, we lecture the Americans on the virtues of free trade and shame them by deregulating financial and labor markets left, right and center. So it was natural that until the 19th century, when we were under the Chinese sphere of influence, we were more Confucian than the Chinese. Confucianism, for those who are not familiar with it, is a cultural system based on the teachings of Confucius, the Latinized name of the Chinese political philosopher, Kongzi, who lived in the 5th century BC. Today, having seen the economic successes of some Confucian countries, many people think it is a culture particularly well suited to economic development, but it was a typical feudal ideology until it came to be adapted to the requirements of modern capitalism in the second half of the 20th century. Point 1. Like most other feudal ideologies, Confucianism espoused a rigid social hierarchy which restricted people's choice of occupation according to their births. This prevented talented men from lower castes from rising above their station. In Confucianism, there was a crucial divide between the farmers, who were considered to be the bedrock of society, and other working classes. The sons of farmers could sit for the incredibly difficult government civil service examination and get incorporated into the ruling class, although this happened rarely in practice, while the sons of artisans and merchants were not even permitted to sit for the exam, however clever they might be. China, being the birthplace of Confucianism, had the confidence to take a more pragmatic approach in interpreting the classical doctrines and allowed people from merchant and artisanal classes to sit for the civil service examination. Korea, being more Confucian than Confucius, adamantly stuck to this doctrine and refused to hire talented people simply because they were born to the wrong parents. It was only after our liberation from Japanese colonial rule, 1910-45, that the traditional caste system was fully abolished and Korea became a country where birth does not set a ceiling to individual achievement. Although the prejudice against artisans, engineers in modern terms, and merchants, business managers in modern terms, lingered on for another few decades until economic development made these attractive professions. Obviously, feudal Korea was not alone in refusing to give people equality of opportunity. European feudal societies operated with similar systems, and in India the caste system still operates, albeit informally. Nor was it only along the caste lines that people were refused equality of opportunity. Until the Second World War, most societies refused to let women be elected to public office. In fact, they were refused political citizenship altogether and not even allowed to vote. Until recently, many countries used to restrict people's access to education and jobs along racial lines. In the late 19th and the early 20th centuries, the USA prohibited the immigration of undesirable races, especially Asians. South Africa, during the apartheid regime, had separate universities for whites and for the rest, the coloreds, and the blacks, which were very poorly funded. So it has not been long since the majority of the world emerged from a situation where people were banned from self-advancement due to their race, gender or caste. Equality of opportunity is something to be highly cherished. Markets liberate? Many of the formal rules restricting equality of opportunity have been abolished in the last few generations. This was in large part because of political struggles by the discriminated against, such as the Chartist demand for universal, male, suffrage in Britain in the mid-19th century, the civil rights movement by blacks in the US in the 1960s, the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa in the second half of the 20th century and the fight by low-caste people in India today. Without these and countless other campaigns by women, oppressed races and lower caste people, we would still be living in a world where restricting people's rights according to birth lottery would be considered natural. In this struggle against inequality of opportunity, the market has been a great help. When only efficiency ensures survival, free market economists point out, there is no room for racial or political prejudices to creep into market transactions. Milton Friedman put it succinctly in his Capitalism and Freedom. No one who buys bread knows whether the wheat from which it was made was grown by a communist or a Republican, by a Negro or a white. Therefore, Friedman argued, the market will eventually drive racism out, or at least reduce it significantly, because those racist employers insisting on employing only white people would be driven out by more open-minded ones who hire the best available talents, regardless of race. This point is powerfully illustrated by the fact that even the notoriously racist apartheid regime in South Africa had to designate the Japanese honorary whites. There was no way the Japanese executives running the local Toyota and Nissan factories could go and live in townships like Soweto, where non-whites were forced to live under apartheid law. Therefore, the white supremacist South Africans had to swallow their pride and pretend that the Japanese were whites, if they wanted to drive around in Japanese cars. That is the power of the market. The power of the market as a leveler is more widespread than we think. As the British writer Alan Bennett's play-turned-movie, History, Boys, so poignantly shows, students from disadvantaged groups tend to lack intellectual and social confidence and are thus disadvantaged in getting into elite universities and, by extension, better-paying jobs. Obviously, universities do not have to respond to market pressures as quickly as firms have to. However, if some university consistently discriminated against ethnic minorities or working-class kids and took in only people from the right backgrounds despite their inferior quality, potential employers would come to prefer the graduates from non-racist universities. The narrow-minded university, if it is to recruit the best possible students, would have to abandon its prejudices sooner or later. Given all this, it is tempting to argue that, once you ensure equality of opportunity, free from any formal discrimination other than according to merit, the market will eliminate any residual prejudices through the competitive mechanism. However, this is only the start. A lot more has to be done to build a genuinely fair society. The end of apartheid and the Cappuccino Society. While there are still too many people with prejudices against certain races, poor people, lower castes and women, today few would openly object to the principle of equality of opportunity. But at this point, opinions divide sharply. Some argue that equality should end with that of opportunity. Others, including myself, believe that it is not enough to have mere formal equality of opportunity. Free market economists warn that, if we try to equalize the outcomes of people's actions and not just their opportunities to take certain actions, that will create huge disincentives against hard work and innovation. Would you work hard if you knew that, whatever you do, you will get paid the same as the next guy who is goofing off? Isn't that exactly why the Chinese agricultural communes under Mao Zedong were such failures? If you tax the rich disproportionately and use the proceeds to finance the welfare state, won't the rich lose the incentive to create wealth, while the poor lose the incentive to work, as they are guaranteed a minimum standard of living whether they work hard or not, or whether they work at all? See Thing 21. This way, free market economists argue, everyone becomes worse off by the attempt to reduce inequality of outcome. See Thing 13. It is absolutely true that excessive attempts to equalize outcomes, say, the Maoist commune, where there was virtually no link between someone's effort and the reward that she got, will have an adverse impact on people's work effort. It is also unfair, but I believe that a certain degree of equalization of outcomes is necessary if we are to build a genuinely fair society. The point is that, in order to benefit from the equal opportunities provided to them, people require the capabilities to make use of them. It is no use that black South Africans now have the same opportunities as whites to get a highly paid job if they do not have the education to qualify for those jobs. It is no good that blacks now can enter better, former white-only, universities if they still have to attend poorly funded schools with underqualified teachers, some of whom can barely read and write themselves. For most black kids in South Africa, the newly acquired equality of opportunity to enter good universities does not mean that they can attend such universities. Their schools are still poor and poorly run. It is not as if their underqualified teachers have suddenly become smart with the end of apartheid. Their parents are still unemployed. Even the official unemployment rate, which vastly underestimates true unemployment in a developing country, is, at 26 to 28%, one of the highest in the world. For them, the right to enter better universities is pie in the sky. For this reason, post-apartheid South Africa has turned into what some South Africans call a cappuccino society, a mass of brown at the bottom, a thin layer of white froth above it, and a sprinkling of cocoa at the top. Now, free market economists will tell you that those who do not have the education, the determination and the entrepreneurial energy to take advantage of market opportunities have only themselves to blame. Why should people who have worked hard and obtained a university degree against all odds be rewarded in the same way as someone, coming from the same poor background, who goes into a life of petty crime? This argument is correct. We cannot, and should not, explain someone's performance only by the environment in which he has grown up. Individuals do have responsibilities for what they have made out of their lives. However, while correct, this argument is only part of the story. Individuals are not born into a vacuum. The socio-economic environment they operate in puts serious restrictions on what they can do, or even on what they want to do. Your environment can make you give up certain things even without trying. For example, many academically talented British working-class children do not even try to go to universities because universities are not for them. This attitude is slowly changing, but I still remember seeing a BBC documentary in the late 1980s in which an old miner and his wife were criticizing one of their sons, who had gone to a university and become a teacher, as a class traitor. While it is silly to blame everything on the socio-economic environment, it is equally unacceptable to believe that people can achieve anything if they only believe in themselves and try hard enough, as Hollywood movies love to tell you. Equality of opportunity is meaningless for those who do not have the capabilities to take advantage of it. The curious case of Alejandro Toledo. Today, no country deliberately keeps poor children from going to school, but many children in poor countries cannot go to school because they do not have the money to pay for the tuition. Moreover, even in countries with free public education, poor children are bound to perform poorly in school, whatever their innate ability may be. Some of them go hungry at home and also skip lunch at school. This makes it impossible for them to concentrate, with predictable results for their academic performance. In extreme cases, their intellectual development may have already been stunted because of a lack of food in their early years. These kids may also suffer more frequently from illness, which makes them skip school more often. If their parents are illiterate and/or have to work long hours, children will have no one to help them with their homework, while middle-class children will be helped by their parents and rich kids may have private tutors. Helped or not, they may not even have enough time for homework if they have to take care of younger siblings or tend the family goats. Given all this, as far as we accept that we should not punish children for having poor parents, we should take action to ensure that all children have some minimum amounts of food, healthcare and help with their homework. Much of this can be provided through public policy, as happens in some countries, free school lunches, vaccinations, basic health checks and some help with homework after school by teachers or tutors hired by the school. However, some of this still needs to be provided at home. Schools can provide only so much. This means that there has to be some minimum equality of outcome in terms of parental income, if poor children are to have anything approaching a fair chance. Without this, even free schooling, free school meals, free vaccinations, and so on, cannot provide real equality of opportunity for children. Even in adult life, there has to be some equality of outcome. It is well known that, once someone has been unemployed for a long time, it becomes extremely difficult for that person to get back into the labor market. But whether someone loses her job is not entirely determined by the person's worth. For example, many people lose their jobs because they chose to join an industry that looked like a good prospect when they first started but since has been hit hard by a sudden increase in foreign competition. Few American steelworkers or British shipbuilding workers who joined their industries in the 1960s, or for that matter anyone else, could have predicted that by the early 1990s their industries would be virtually wiped out by Japanese and Korean competition. Is it really fair that these people have to suffer disproportionately and be consigned to the scrap heap of history? Of course, in an idealized free market, this should not be a problem because the American steelworkers and the British shipbuilders can get jobs in expanding industries. But how many former American steelworkers do you know who have become computer engineers or former British shipbuilders who have turned themselves into investment bankers? Such conversion rarely, if ever, happens. A more equitable approach would have been to help the displaced workers find a new career through decent unemployment benefits, health insurance even when out of a job, retraining schemes and help with job searches, as they do particularly well in Scandinavian countries. As I discuss elsewhere in the book, see Thing 21, this can also be a more productive approach for the economy as a whole. Yes, in theory, a shoeshine boy from a poor provincial town in Peru can go to Stanford and do a PhD, as the former Peruvian president Alejandro Toledo has done, but for one Toledo we have millions of Peruvian children who did not even make it to high school. Of course, we could argue that all those millions of poor Peruvian children are lazy good-for-nothings, since Mr. Toledo has proven that they too could have gone to Stanford if they had tried hard enough. But I think it is much more plausible to say that Mr. Toledo is the exception. Without some equality of outcome, of parental income, poor people cannot take full advantage of equality of opportunity. Indeed, international comparison of social mobility corroborates this reasoning. According to a careful study by a group of researchers in Scandinavia and the UK, the Scandinavian countries have higher social mobility than the UK, which in turn has higher mobility than the US. 2. It is no coincidence that the stronger the welfare state, the higher the mobility. Particularly in the case of the US, the fact that low overall mobility is largely accounted for by low mobility at the bottom suggests that it is the lack of a basic income guarantee that is preventing poor kids from making use of the equality of opportunity. Excessive equalization of outcomes is harmful, although what exactly is excessive is debatable. Nevertheless, equality of opportunity is not enough. Unless we create an environment where everyone is guaranteed some minimum capabilities through some guarantee of minimum income, education and healthcare, we cannot say that we have fair competition. When some people have to run a 100-meter race with sandbags on their legs, the fact that no one is allowed to have a head start does not make the race fair. Equality of opportunity is absolutely necessary but not sufficient in building a genuinely fair and efficient society. Thing 21. Big government makes people more open to change. What they tell you. Big government is bad for the economy. The welfare state has emerged because of the desire by the poor to have an easier life by making the rich pay for the costs of adjustments that are constantly demanded by market forces. When the rich are taxed to pay for unemployment insurance, healthcare and other welfare measures for the poor, this not only makes the poor lazy and deprives the rich of an incentive to create wealth, it also makes the economy less dynamic. With the protection of the welfare state, people do not feel the need to adjust to new market realities, thereby delaying the changes in their professions and working patterns that are needed for dynamic economic adjustments. We don't even have to invoke the failures of the communist economies. Just look at the lack of dynamism in Europe with its bloated welfare state, compared to the vitality of the US. What they don't tell you. A well-designed welfare state can actually encourage people to take chances with their jobs and be more, not less, open to changes. This is one reason why there is less demand for trade protectionism in Europe than in the US. Europeans know that, even if their industries shut down due to foreign competition, they will be able to protect their living standards, through unemployment benefits, and get retrained for another job, with government subsidies. Whereas Americans know that losing their current jobs may mean a huge fall in their living standards and may even be the end of their productive lives. This is why the European countries with the biggest welfare states, such as Sweden, Norway and Finland, were able to grow faster than, or at least as fast as, the US, even during the post-1990 feet American Renaissance. The oldest profession in the world? Representatives of different professions in a Christian country were debating which profession is the oldest. The medical doctor said, "What was the first thing that God did with humans? He performed an operation. He made Eve with Adam's rib. The medical profession is the oldest." "No, that is not true," the architect said. "The first thing he did was to build the world out of chaos. That's what architects do, creating order out of chaos. We are the oldest profession." The politician, who was patiently listening, grinned and asked, "Who created that chaos?" Medicine may or may not be the oldest profession in the world, but it is one of the most popular all over the world. However, in no country is it more popular than in my native South Korea. A survey done in 2003 revealed that nearly 4 out of 5 top-scoring university applicants, defined as those within the top 2% of the distribution, in the science stream wanted to study medicine. According to unofficial data, during the last few years, even the least competitive of the country's 27 medical departments, at undergraduate level, has become more difficult to enter than the best engineering departments in the country. It cannot get more popular than that. The interesting thing is that, even though medicine has always been a popular subject in Korea, this kind of hyper-popularity is new. It is basically a 21st century phenomenon. What has changed? An obvious possibility is that, for whatever reason, e.g., an aging population, the relative earnings of medical doctors have risen and the youngsters are merely responding to changes in the incentives. The market wants more able doctors, so more and more able people are going into the profession. However, the relative incomes of medical doctors in Korea have been falling, with the continuous increase in their supply. And it is not as if some new government regulation was introduced that makes it difficult to get jobs as engineers or scientists, the obvious alternative choices for would-be medical doctors. So what is really going on? What is driving this is the dramatic fall in job security over the last decade or so. After the 1997 financial crisis that ended the country's miracle years, Korea abandoned its interventionist, paternalistic economic system and embraced market liberalism that emphasizes maximum competition. Job security has been drastically reduced in the name of greater labor market flexibility. Millions of workers have been forced into temporary jobs. Ironically enough, even before the crisis, the country had one of the most flexible labor markets in the rich world, with one of the highest ratios of workers without a permanent contract at around 50%. The recent liberalization has pushed the ratio up even higher, to around 60%. Moreover, even those with permanent contracts now suffer from heightened job insecurity. Before the 1997 crisis, most workers with a permanent contract could expect, de facto if not de jure, lifetime employment, as many of their Japanese counterparts still do. Not anymore. Now older workers in their 40s and 50s, even if they have a permanent contract, are encouraged to make way for the younger generation at the earliest possible chance. Companies cannot fire them at will, but we all know that there are ways to let people know that they are not wanted and thus to make them, voluntarily, leave. Given this, Korean youngsters are, understandably, playing safe. If they become a scientist or an engineer, they reckon, there is a high chance that they will be out of their jobs in their 40s, even if they join major companies like Samsung or Hyundai. This is a horrendous prospect, since the welfare state in Korea is so weak, the smallest among the rich countries, measured by public social spending as a share of GDP. 0.1 A weak welfare state was not such a big problem before, because many people had lifetime employment. With lifetime employment gone, it has become lethal. Once you lose your job, your living standard falls dramatically and, more importantly, you don't have much of a second chance. Thus, bright Korean youngsters figure, and are advised by their parents, that with a license to practice medicine they can work until they choose to retire. If the worst comes to the worst, they can set up their own clinics, even if they do not make much money, well, for a medical doctor. No wonder every Korean kid with a brain wants to study medicine or law, another profession with a license, if they are in the humanities stream. Don't get me wrong, I revere medical doctors. I owe my life to them. I have had a couple of life-saving operations and been cured of countless infections thanks to antibiotics they have prescribed for me. But even I know that it is impossible for 80% of the brainiest Korean kids in the science stream all to be cut out to be medical doctors. So, one of the freest labor markets in the rich world, that is, the Korean labor market, is spectacularly failing to allocate talent in the most efficient manner. The reason? Heightened job insecurity. The welfare state is the bankruptcy law for workers. Job security is a thorny issue. Free market economists believe that any labor market regulation that makes firing more difficult makes the economy less efficient and dynamic. To start with, it weakens the incentive for workers to work hard. On top of that, It discourages wealth creation by making employers more reluctant to hire additional people, for fear of not being able to fire them when necessary. Labor market regulations are bad enough, it is argued, but the welfare state has made things even worse. By providing unemployment benefits, health insurance, free education and even minimum income support, the welfare state has effectively given everyone a guarantee to be hired by the government, as an unemployed worker, if you like, with a minimum wage. Therefore, workers do not have enough incentive to work hard. To make things worse, these welfare states are financed by taxing the rich, reducing their incentives to work hard, create jobs and generate wealth. Given this, the reasoning goes, a country with a bigger welfare state is going to be less dynamic, its workers are less compelled to work, while its entrepreneurs are less motivated to create wealth. This argument has been very influential. In the 1970s, a popular explanation of Britain's then lackluster economic performance was that its welfare state had become bloated and its trade unions overly powerful, which is also partly due to the welfare state, insofar as the latter dulls the threat of unemployment. In this reading of British history, Margaret Thatcher saved Britain by putting unions in their place and reducing the welfare state, even though what actually happened is more complicated. Since the 1990s, this view of the welfare state has become even more popular with the, allegedly, superior growth performance of the US to those of other rich countries with bigger welfare states. Point 2. When governments in other countries try to cut their welfare spending, they frequently cite Mrs. Thatcher's curing of the so-called British disease, or the superior dynamism of the US economy. But is it true that greater job security and a bigger welfare state make an economy less productive and dynamic? As in our Korean example, a lack of job security can lead youngsters to make conservative choices with their career, favoring secure jobs in medicine or the law. This may be the right choice for them individually, but it leads to a misallocation of talents and thus reduces economic efficiency and dynamism. The weaker welfare state in the US has been one important reason why trade protectionism is much stronger there than in Europe, despite a greater acceptance of government intervention in the latter. In Europe, of course, I am ignoring national differences in the details. If your industry declines and you lose your job, it is a big blow but not the end of the world. You will still keep your health insurance and public housing, or housing subsidies, while receiving unemployment benefits, up to 80% of your last pay, government-subsidized retraining and government help in your job search. In contrast, if you are a worker in the US, you'd better make sure you hold on to your current job, if necessary through protectionism, because losing your job means losing almost everything. Unemployment insurance coverage is patchy and of shorter duration than in Europe. There is little public help with retraining and job search. More frighteningly, losing your job means losing your health insurance and probably your home, as there is little public housing or public subsidies for your rent. As a result, worker resistance to any industrial restructuring that involves job cuts is much greater in the US than in Europe. Most US workers are unable to put up an organized resistance, but those who can, unionized workers, will, understandably, do everything they can to preserve the current job distribution. As the above examples show, greater insecurity may make people work harder, but it makes them work harder in the wrong jobs. All those talented, Korean youngsters who could be brilliant scientists and engineers are laboring over human anatomy. Many US workers who could, after appropriate retraining, be working in sunrise industries, e.g., bioengineering, or grimly holding on to their jobs in sunset industries, e.g., automobiles, only delaying the inevitable. The point of all the above examples is that, when people know they will have a second or third or even fourth chance, they will be much more open to risk-taking when it comes to choosing their first job, as in the Korean example, or letting go of their existing jobs, as in the US-Europe comparison. Do you find this logic strange? You shouldn't, because this is exactly the logic behind bankruptcy law, which most people accept as obvious. Before the mid-19th century, no country had a bankruptcy law in the modern sense. What was then called bankruptcy law did not give bankrupt businessmen much protection from creditors while they restructured their business. In the US, Chapter 11 feet now gives such protection for 6 months. More importantly, it did not give them a second chance, as they were required to pay back all debts, however long it took, unless the creditors gave them a discharge from the duty. This meant that, even if the bankrupt businessman somehow managed to start a new business, he had to use all his new profits to repay the old debts, which hampered the growth of the new business. All this made it extremely risky to start a business venture in the first place. Over time, people came to realize that the lack of a second chance was hugely discouraging risk-taking by businessmen. Starting with Britain in 1849, countries have introduced modern bankruptcy laws with court-granted protection from creditors during initial restructuring and, more importantly, the power for courts to impose permanent reductions in debts, even against the wishes of the creditors. When combined with institutions like limited liability, which was introduced around the same time, see Thing 2, This new bankruptcy law reduced the danger of any business undertaking and thus encouraged risk-taking, which has made modern capitalism possible. Insofar as it gives workers second chances, we can say that the welfare state is like a bankruptcy law for them. In the same way that bankruptcy laws encourage risk-taking by entrepreneurs, the welfare state encourages workers to be more open to change, and the resulting risks, in their attitudes. Because they know that there is going to be a second chance, people can be bolder in their initial career choices and more open to changing jobs later in their careers. Countries with bigger governments can grow faster. What about the evidence? What are the relative economic performances of countries that differ in terms of the sizes of their welfare states? As mentioned, the conventional wisdom is that countries with smaller welfare states are more dynamic. However, the evidence does not support this view. Until the 1980s, the US grew much more slowly than Europe despite the fact that it had a much smaller welfare state. For example, in 1980, public social expenditure as a share of GDP was only 13.3% in the US, compared to 19.9% for the EU's 15 countries. The ratio was as high as 28.6% in Sweden, 24.1% in the Netherlands and 23% in West Germany. Despite this, between 1950 and 1987, the US grew more slowly than any European country. Per capita income grew at 3.8% in Germany, 2.7% in Sweden, 2.5% in the Netherlands and 1.9% in the US during this period. Obviously, the size of the welfare state is only one factor in determining a country's economic performance, but this shows that a large welfare state is not incompatible with high growth. Even since 1990, when the relative growth performance of the US has improved, some countries with large welfare states have grown faster. For example, between 1990 and 2008, per capita income in the US grew at 1.8%. This is basically the same as in the previous period, but given the slowdown in the European economies, this made the US one of the fastest growing economies in the core OECD group. That is, excluding the not fully rich yet countries, such as Korea and Turkey. The interesting thing, however, is that the two fastest growing economies in the core OECD group during the post-1990 period are Finland, 2.6%, and Norway, 2.5%, both with a large welfare state. In 2003, the share of public social spending in GDP was 22.5% in Finland and 25.1% in Norway, compared to the OECD average of 20.7% and 16.2% in the US. Sweden, which has literally the largest welfare state in the world, 31.3%, or twice as large as that of the US, at 1.8%, recorded a growth rate that was only a shade below the US rate. If you count only the 2000s, 2008, the growth rates of Sweden, 2.4%, and Finland, 2.8%, were far superior to that of the US, 1.8%. Were the free market economists right about the detrimental effects of the welfare state on work ethic and the incentives for wealth creation? This kind of thing should not happen. Of course, by all this I am not suggesting that the welfare state is necessarily good. Like all other institutions, it has its upsides and downsides. Especially if it is based on targeted, rather than universal, programs, as in the US, it can stigmatize welfare recipients. The welfare state raises people's reservation wages, and deters them from taking low-paying jobs with poor working conditions, although whether this is a bad thing is a matter of opinion. Personally, I think the existence of a large number of working poor, as in the US, is as much of a problem as the generally higher unemployment rates we see in Europe. However, if it is well designed, with a view to giving workers a second chance, as it is in Scandinavian countries, it can encourage economic growth by making people be more open to changes and thus making industrial restructuring easier. We can drive our cars fast only because we have brakes. If cars had no brakes, even the most skillful drivers would not dare to drive at more than 20 to 30 miles per hour for fear of fatal accidents. In the same way, people can accept the risk of unemployment and the need for occasional retooling of their skills more willingly when they know that those experiences are not going to destroy their lives. This is why a bigger government can make people more open to change and thus make the economy more dynamic. Thing 22. Financial markets need to become less, not more, efficient. What they tell you. The rapid development of the financial markets has enabled us to allocate and reallocate resources swiftly. This is why the US, the UK, Ireland and some other capitalist economies that have liberalized and opened up their financial markets have done so well in the last 3 decades. Liberal financial markets give an economy the ability to respond quickly to changing opportunities, thereby allowing it to grow faster. True, some of the excesses of the recent period have given finance a bad name, not least in the above-mentioned countries. However, we should not rush into restraining financial markets simply because of this once-in-a-century financial crisis that no one could have predicted, however big it may be, as the efficiency of its financial market is the key to a nation's prosperity. What they don't tell you. The problem with financial markets today is that they are too efficient. With recent financial innovations that have produced so many new financial instruments, the financial sector has become more efficient in generating profits for itself in the short run. However, as seen in the 2008 global crisis, these new financial assets have made the overall economy, as well as the financial system itself, much more unstable. Moreover, given the liquidity of their assets, the holders of financial assets are too quick to respond to change, which makes it difficult for real sector companies to secure the patient capital that they need for long-term development. The speed gap between the financial sector and the real sector needs to be reduced, which means that the financial market needs to be deliberately made less efficient. 3 useless phrases. Visitors to Iceland in the 1990s reported that the official tourist guide handed out at Reykjavik airport had, like all other such guides, a useful phrases section. Unlike them, I was told, the Icelandic guide also had a useless phrases section. Apparently it contained 3 phrases, which were, in English, "Where's the railway station? It's a nice day today," and "Is there anything cheaper?" The railways thing is, surprising though it may be, true. Iceland does not have any railways. About the weather, the guide was perhaps being overly harsh. I haven't lived there, but by all accounts Iceland does seem to have at least a few sunny days a year. As for everything being so expensive, this was also pretty accurate and a consequence of the country's economic success. Labor services are expensive in high-income countries, unless they have a constant supply of low-wage immigrants, as the US or Australia, making everything more expensive than what the official exchange rate should suggest, see Thing 10. Once one of the poorest economies in Europe, by 1995 Iceland had developed into the 11th richest economy in the world, after Luxembourg, Switzerland, Japan, Norway, Denmark, Germany, the United States, Austria, Singapore and France. Rich as it already was, the Icelandic economy got a turbocharged boost in the late 1990s, thanks to the then government's decision to privatize and liberalize the financial sector. Between 1998 and 2003, the country privatized state-owned banks and investment funds, while abolishing even the most basic regulations on their activities, such as reserve requirements for the banks. Following this, the Icelandic banks expanded at an astonishing speed, seeking customers abroad as well. Their internet banking facilities made big inroads in Britain, the Netherlands and Germany. And Icelandic investors took advantage of the aggressive lending by their banks and went on corporate shopping sprees, especially in Britain, its former adversary in the famous Cod Wars of the 1950s to 1970s. These investors, dubbed the Viking Raiders, were best represented by Bogger, the investment company owned by John Johannesson, the young business tycoon. Bursting onto the scene only in the early 2000s, by 2007 Bogger had become a major force in the British retail industry, with major stakes in businesses employing about 65,000 people, turning over £10 billion across 3,800 stores, including Hamleys, Debenhams, Oasis and Iceland, the temptingly named British frozen food chain. For a while, the financial expansion seemed to work wonders for Iceland. Once a financial backwater with a reputation for excessive regulation, its stock market was only set up in 1985. The country was transformed into a vibrant new hub in the emerging global financial system. From the late 1990s, Iceland grew at an extraordinary rate and became the 5th richest country in the world by 2007, after Norway, Luxembourg, Switzerland and Denmark. The sky seemed to be the limit. Unfortunately, after the global financial crisis of 2008, the Icelandic economy went into meltdown. That summer, all 3 of its biggest banks went bankrupt and had to be taken over by the government. Things got so bad that, in October 2009, McDonald's decided to withdraw from Iceland, relegating it to the borderland of globalization. At the time of writing, early 2010, the IMF estimate was that its economy shrank at the rate of 8.5% in 2009, the fastest rate of contraction among the rich countries. The risky nature of Iceland's financial drive since the late 1990s is increasingly coming to light. Banking assets had reached the equivalent of 1,000% of GDP in 2007, which was double that of the UK, a country with one of the most developed banking sectors in the world. Moreover, Iceland's financial expansion had been fueled by foreign borrowing. By 2007, net foreign debts minus foreign lending, reached nearly 250% of GDP, up from 50% of GDP in 1997. Countries have gone to pieces with far less exposure. Foreign debts were equivalent to 25% of GDP in Korea and 35% of GDP in Indonesia on the eve of the Asian financial crisis in 1997. On top of that, the shady nature of the financial deals behind the Icelandic economic miracle was revealed. Very often the main borrowers from the banks were key shareholders of those same banks. New engine of growth? Why am I spending so much time talking about a small island with just over 300,000 people that does not even have a train station or a McDonald's, however dramatic its rise and fall may have been? It is because Iceland epitomizes what is wrong with the dominant view of finance today. Extraordinary though Iceland's story may sound, it was not alone in fueling growth by privatizing, liberalizing and opening up the financial sector during the last 3 decades. Ireland tried to become another financial hub through the same strategy, with its financial assets reaching the equivalent of 900% of GDP in 2007. Like Iceland, Ireland also had a bad fall in the 2008 global financial crisis. At the time of writing, the IMF estimate was that its economy contracted by 7.5% in 2009. Latvia, another aspiring financial hub, has had it even worse. Following the collapse of its finance-driven boom, its economy was estimated by the IMF to have shrunk by 16% in 2009. Dubai, the self-appointed financial hub of the Middle East, seemed to hold on a bit longer than its European rivals, but threw in the towel by declaring a debt moratorium for its main state-owned conglomerate in November 2009. Before their recent falls from grace, these economies were touted as examples of a new finance-led business model for countries that want to get ahead in the era of globalization. As late as November 2007, when the storm clouds were rapidly gathering in the international financial markets. Richard Portes, a prominent British policy economist, and Fredrik Baldursson, an Icelandic professor, solemnly declared in a report for the Iceland Chamber of Commerce that, overall, the internationalization of the Icelandic financial sector is a remarkable success story that the markets should better acknowledge. Point 1 for some, even the recent collapses of Iceland, Ireland and Latvia have not been enough reason to abandon a finance-led economic strategy. In September 2009, Turkey announced that it will implement a series of policies that will turn itself into yet another financial hub of the Middle East. Even the government of Korea, a traditional manufacturing powerhouse, is implementing policies aimed at turning itself into the financial hub of Northeast Asia, although its enthusiasm has been dented since the collapse of Ireland and Dubai, after which it was hoping to model the country. Now, the real trouble is that what countries like Iceland and Ireland were implementing were only more extreme forms of the economic strategy being pursued by many countries, a growth strategy based on financial deregulation, first adopted by the US and the UK in the early 1980s. The UK put its financial deregulation program into a higher gear in the late 1980s, with the so-called Big Bang deregulation, and since then has prided itself on light touch regulation. The US matched it by abolishing the 1933 Glass-Steagall Act in 1999, thereby tearing down the wall between investment banking and commercial banking, which had defined the U.S. financial industry since the Great Depression. Many other countries followed suit. What was encouraging more and more countries to adopt a growth strategy based on deregulated finance was the fact that in such a system it is easier to make money in financial activities than through other economic activities, or so it seemed until the 2008 crisis. A study by 2 French economists, Gérard Dumenil and Dominique Lévy, one of the few studies separately estimating the profit rate of the financial sector and that of the non-financial sector, shows that the former has been much higher than the latter in the US and in France during the last 2 or 3 decades. Point 2. According to this study, in the US the rate of profit for financial firms was lower than that of the non-financial firms between the mid-1960s and the late 1970s. But, following financial deregulation in the early 1980s, the profit rate of financial firms has been on a rising trend, and ranged between 4% and 12%. Since the 1980s, it has always been significantly higher than that of non-financial firms, which ranged between 2% and 5%. In France, the profit rate of financial corporations was negative between the early 1970s and the mid-1980s. No data is available for the 1960s. However, with the financial deregulation of the late 1980s, it started rising and overtook that of non-financial firms in the early 1990s, when both were about 5%, and rose to over 10% by 2001. In contrast, the profit rate of French non-financial firms declined from the early 1990s, to reach around 3% in 2001. In the US, the financial sector became so attractive that even many manufacturing companies have turned themselves essentially into finance companies. Jim Crotty, the distinguished American economist, has calculated that the ratio of financial assets to non-financial assets owned by non-financial corporations in the U.S. rose from around 0.4 in the 1970s to nearly 1 in the early 2000s. 3 Even companies such as GE, GM and Ford, once the symbols of American manufacturing prowess, have been financialized through a continuous expansion of their financial arms, coupled with the decline of their core manufacturing activities. By the early 21st century, These manufacturing firms were making most of their profits through financial activities, rather than their core manufacturing businesses, see Thing 18. For example, in 2003, 45% of GE's profit came from GE Capital. In 2004, 80% of profits of GM were from its financial arm, GMAC, while Ford made all its profits from Ford Finance between 2001 and 2003.4. Weapons of financial mass destruction? The result of all this was an extraordinary growth in the financial sector across the world, especially in the rich countries. The growth was not simply in absolute terms. The more significant point is that the financial sector has grown much faster, much faster, than the underlying economy. According to a calculation based on IMF data by Gabriel Palma, my colleague at Cambridge and a leading authority on financial crises, the ratio of the stock of financial assets to world output rose from 1.2 to 4.4 between 1980 and 2007.5. The relative size of the financial sector was even greater in many rich countries. According to his calculation, the ratio of financial assets to GDP in the UK reached 700% in 2007. France, which often styles itself as a counterpoint to Anglo-American finance capitalism, has not lagged far behind the UK in this respect. The ratio of its financial assets to GDP is only marginally lower than that of the UK. In the study cited above, Crotty, using American government data, calculates that the ratio of financial assets to GDP in the US fluctuated between 400 and 500% between the 1950s and the 1970s, but started shooting up from the early 1980s with financial deregulation, to break through the 900% mark by the early 2000s. This meant that more and more financial claims were being created for each underlying real asset in economic activity. The creation of financial derivatives in the housing market, which was one of the main causes of the 2008 crisis, illustrates this point very well. In the old days, when someone borrowed money from a bank and bought a house, the lending bank used to own the resulting financial product, mortgage, and that was that. However, financial innovations created mortgage-backed securities, MBSs, which bundle together up to several thousand mortgages. In turn, these MBSs, sometimes as many as 150 of them, were packed into a collateralized debt obligation, CDO. Then, CDOs squared were created by using other CDOs as collateral. And then, CDOs cubed were created by combining CDOs and CDOs squared. Even higher-powered CDOs were created. Credit default swaps, CDSs, were created to protect you from default on the CDOs. And there are many more financial derivatives that make up the alphabet soup that is modern finance. By now even I am getting confused, and, as it turns out, so were the people dealing with them. But the point is that the same underlying assets, that is, the houses that were in the original mortgages, and economic activities, the income-earning activities of those mortgage holders, were being used again and again to derive new assets. But, whatever you do in terms of financial alchemy, whether these assets deliver the expected returns depends ultimately on whether those hundreds of thousands of workers and small-scale business owners who hold the original mortgages fall behind their mortgage payments or not. The result was an increasingly tall structure of financial assets teetering on the same foundation of real assets. Of course, the base itself was growing, in part fueled by this activity, but let us abstract from that for the moment, since what matters here is that the size of the superstructure relative to the base was growing. If you make an existing building taller without widening the base, you increase the chance of it toppling over. It is actually a lot worse than that. As the degree of derivation, or the distance from the underlying assets, increases, it becomes harder and harder to price the asset accurately. So, you are not only adding floors to an existing building without broadening its base, but you are using materials of increasingly uncertain quality for the higher floors. No wonder Warren Buffett, the American financier known for his down-to-earth approach to investment, called financial derivatives weapons of financial mass destruction, well before the 2008 crisis proved their destructiveness. Mind the gap. All my criticisms so far about the overdevelopment of the financial sector in the last 2 or 3 decades are not to say that all finance is a bad thing. Had we listened to Adam Smith, who opposed limited liability companies, see Thing 2, or Thomas Jefferson, who considered banking to be more dangerous than standing armies, our economies would still be made up of the satanic mills of the Victorian age, if not necessarily Adam Smith's pin factories. However, the fact that financial development has been crucial in developing capitalism does not mean that all forms of financial development are good. What makes financial capital necessary for economic development but potentially counterproductive or even destructive is the fact that it is much more liquid than industrial capital. Suppose that you are a factory owner who suddenly needs money to buy raw materials or machines to fulfill unexpected extra orders. Suppose also that you have already invested everything you have in building the factory and buying the machines and the inputs needed for the initial orders. You will be grateful that there are banks that are willing to lend you the money, using your factory as collateral, in the knowledge that you will be able to generate extra income with those new inputs. Or suppose that you want to sell half of your factory, say, to start another line of business, but that no one will buy half a building and half a production line. In this case, you will be relieved to know that you can issue shares and sell half your shares. In other words, the financial sector helps companies to expand and diversify through its ability to turn illiquid assets such as buildings and machines into liquid assets such as loans and shares. However, the very liquidity of financial assets makes them potentially negative for the rest of the economy. Building a factory takes at least months, if not years, while accumulating the technological and organizational know-how needed to build a world-class company takes decades. In contrast, financial assets can be moved around and rearranged in minutes, if not seconds. This enormous gap has created huge problems, because finance capital is impatient and seeks short-term gains, see thing. 2. In the short run, this creates economic instability, as liquid capital sloshes around the world at very short notice and in irrational ways, as we have recently seen. More importantly, in the long run, it leads to weak productivity growth, because long-term investments are cut down to satisfy impatient capital. The result has been that, despite enormous progress in financial deepening, that is, the increase in the ratio between financial assets and GDP, growth has actually slowed down in recent years, see Things 7 and 13. Thus, exactly because finance is efficient at responding to changing profit opportunities, it can become harmful for the rest of the economy. And this is why James Tobin, the 1981 Nobel laureate in economics, talked of the need to throw some sand in the wheels of our excessively efficient international money markets. For this purpose, Tobin proposed a financial transaction tax, deliberately intended to slow down financial flows. A taboo in polite circles until recently, the so-called Tobin tax has recently been advocated by Gordon Brown, the former British Prime Minister. But the Tobin tax is not the only way in which we can reduce the speed gap between finance and the real economy. Other means include making hostile takeovers difficult, thereby reducing the gains from speculative investment in stocks, banning short selling, the practice of selling shares that you do not own today, increasing margin requirements, that is, the proportion of the money that has to be paid up front when buying shares, or putting restrictions on cross-border capital movements, especially for developing countries. All this is not to say that the speed gap between finance and the real economy should be reduced to zero. A financial system perfectly synchronized with the real economy would be useless. The whole point of finance is that it can move faster than the real economy. However, if the financial sector moves too fast, it can derail the real economy. In the present circumstances, we need to rewire our financial system so that it allows firms to make those long-term investments in physical capital, human skills and organizations that are ultimately the source of economic development, while supplying them with the necessary liquidity. Thing 23. Good economic policy does not require good economists. What they tell you. Whatever the theoretical justifications may be for government intervention, the success or otherwise of government policies depends in large part on the competence of those who design and execute them. Especially, albeit not exclusively, in developing countries, government officials are not very well trained in economics, which they need to be if they are to implement good economic policies. Those officials should recognize their limits and should refrain from implementing difficult policies, such as selective industrial policy, and stick to less demanding free market policies, which minimize the role of the government. Thus seen, free market policies are doubly good, because not only are they the best policies but they are also the lightest in their demands for bureaucratic capabilities. What they don't tell you. Good economists are not required to run good economic policies. The economic bureaucrats that have been most successful are usually not economists. During their miracle years, economic policies in Japan and, to a lesser extent, Korea were run by lawyers. In Taiwan and China, economic policies have been run by engineers. This demonstrates that economic success does not need people well trained in economics, especially if it is of the free market kind. Indeed, during the last 3 decades, the increasing influence of free market economics has resulted in poorer economic performances all over the world, as I have shown throughout this book, lower economic growth, greater economic instability, increased inequality and finally culminating in the disaster of the 2008 global financial crisis. Insofar as we need economics, we need different kinds of economics from free market economics. Economic miracle without economists. The East Asian economies of Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong and China are often called miracle economies. This is, of course, hyperbole, but as far as hyperboles go, it is not too outlandish. During their industrial revolution, in the 19th century, per capita income in the economies of Western Europe and its offshoots, North America, Australia and New Zealand, grew between 1% and 1.5% per year, the exact number depending on the exact time period and the country you look at. During the so-called golden age of capitalism between the early 1950s and the mid-1970s, per capita income in Western Europe and its offshoots grew at around 3.5 to 4% per year. In contrast, during their miracle years, roughly between the 1950s and the mid-1990s, and between the 1980s and today in the case of China, per capita incomes grew at something like 6 to 7% per year in the East Asian economies mentioned above. If growth rates of 1 to 1.5% describe a revolution, and 3.5 to 4% a golden age, 6 to 7% deserves to be called a miracle. Point 1. Given these economic records, one would naturally surmise that these countries must have had a lot of good economists. In the same way in which Germany excels in engineering because of the quality of its engineers and France leads the world in designer goods because of the talents of its designers, it seems obvious the East Asian countries must have achieved economic miracles because of the capability of their economists. Especially in Japan, Taiwan, South Korea and China, countries in which the government played a very active role during the miracle years. There must have been many first-rate economists working for the government, one would reason. Not so. Economists were in fact conspicuous by their absence in the governments of the East Asian miracle economies. Japanese economic bureaucrats were mostly lawyers by training. In Taiwan, most key economic officials were engineers and scientists, rather than economists, as is the case in China today. Korea also had a high proportion of lawyers in its economic bureaucracy, especially before the 1980s. Oh Chol, the brains behind the country's heavy and chemical industrialization program in the 1970s, which transformed its economy from an efficient exporter of low-grade manufacturing products into a world-class player in electronics, steel and shipbuilding, was an engineer by training. If we don't need economists to have good economic performance, as in the East Asian cases, what use is economics? Have the IMF, the World Bank and other international organizations been wasting money when they provided economics training courses for developing country government officials and scholarships for bright young things from those countries to study in American or British universities renowned for their excellence in economics? A possible explanation of the East Asian experience is that what is needed in those who are running economic policy is general intelligence, rather than specialist knowledge in economics. It may be that the economics taught in university classrooms is too detached from reality to be of practical use. If this is the case, the government will acquire more able economic policymakers by recruiting those who have studied what happens to be the most prestigious subject in the country, which could be law, engineering or even economics, depending on the country, rather than a subject that is notionally most relevant for economic policymaking, that is, economics, see Thing 17. This conjecture is indirectly supported by the fact that although economic policies in many Latin American countries have been run by economists, and very highly trained ones at that, the Chicago Boys of General Pinochet being the most prominent example, their economic performance has been much inferior to that of the East Asian countries. India and Pakistan also have many world-class economists, but their economic performance is no match for the East Asian one. John Kenneth Galbraith, the wittiest economist in history, was certainly exaggerating when he said that economics is extremely useful as a form of employment for economists, but he may not have been far off the mark. Economics does not seem very relevant for economic management in the real world. Actually, it is worse than that. There are reasons to think that economics may be positively harmful for the economy. How come nobody could foresee it? In November 2008, Queen Elizabeth II visited the London School of Economics, which has one of the most highly regarded economics departments in the world. When given a presentation by one of the professors there, Professor Luis Garicano, on the financial crisis that had just engulfed the world, the Queen asked, "How come nobody could foresee it?" Her Majesty asked a question that had been in most people's minds since the outbreak of the crisis in the autumn of 2008. During the last couple of decades, we were repeatedly told by all those highly qualified experts, from Nobel Prize-winning economists through world-class financial regulators to frighteningly bright young investment bankers with economics degrees from the world's top universities, that all was well with the world economy. We were told that economists had finally found the magic formula that allowed our economies to grow rapidly with low inflation. People talked of the Goldilocks economy, in which things are just right, not too hot, not too cold. Alan Greenspan, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, who presided over the world's biggest and, financially and ideologically, most influential economy for 2 decades, was hailed as a maestro, as the title of the book on him by the journalist Bob Woodward of Watergate fame had it. His successor, Ben Bernanke, talked of a great moderation, which came with the taming of inflation and disappearance of violent economic cycles, see Thing 6. So it was a real puzzle to most people, including the Queen, that things could go so spectacularly wrong in a world where clever economists were supposed to have sorted out all the major problems. How could all those clever guys with degrees from some of the best universities, with hypermathematical equations coming out of their ears, have been so wrong? Learning of the sovereign's concern, the British Academy convened a meeting of some of the top economists from academia, the financial sector and the government on the 17th of June 2009. The result of this meeting was conveyed to the Queen in a letter, dated the 22nd of July 2009, written by Professor Tim Besley, a prominent economics professor at the LSE, and Professor Peter Hennessy, a renowned historian of British government at Queen Mary University of London. Point 2. In the letter, Professors Besley and Hennessy said that individual economists were competent in doing their job properly on its own merit, but that they lost sight of the wood for the trees in the run-up to the crisis. There was, according to them, a failure of the collective imagination of many bright people, both in this country and internationally, to understand the risks to the system as a whole. A failure of the collective imagination? Hadn't most economists, including most, although not all, of those who were at the British Academy meeting, told the rest of us that free markets work best because we are rational and individualistic and thus know what we want for ourselves, and no one else, possibly except for our immediate families, and how to get it most efficiently? See things 5 and 16. I don't remember seeing much discussion in economics about imagination, especially of the collective kind, and I've been in the economics profession for the last 2 decades. I am not even sure whether a concept like imagination, collective or otherwise, has a place in the dominant rationalist discourse in economics. The great and the good of the economics world of Britain, then, were basically admitting that they don't know what has gone wrong. But this understates it. Economists are not some innocent technicians who did a decent job within the narrow confines of their expertise until they were collectively wrong-footed by a once-in-a-century disaster that no one could have predicted. Over the last 3 decades, economists played an important role in creating the conditions of the 2008 crisis and dozens of smaller financial crises that came before it since the early 1980s, such as the 1982 Third World Debt Crisis, the 1995 Mexican Peso Crisis, the 1997 Asian Crisis and the 1998 Russian Crisis, by providing theoretical justifications for financial deregulation and the unrestrained pursuit of short-term profits. More broadly, they advanced theories that justified the policies that have led to slower growth, higher inequality, heightened job insecurity and more frequent financial crises that have dogged the world in the last 3 decades. See things 2, 6, 13 and 21. On top of that, they pushed for policies that weakened the prospects for long-term development in developing countries. See things 7 and 11. In the rich countries, these economists encouraged people to overestimate the power of new technologies. See thing 4, made people's lives more and more unstable. See thing 6, made them ignore the loss of national control over the economy. See thing 8, and rendered them complacent about deindustrialization. See thing 9. Moreover, they supplied arguments that insist that all those economic outcomes that many people find objectionable in this world, such as rising inequality, see thing 13, sky-high executive salaries, see thing 14, or extreme poverty in poor countries, see thing 3, are really inevitable, given selfish and rational human nature and the need to reward people according to their productive contributions. In other words, economics has been worse than irrelevant. Economics, as it has been practiced in the last 3 decades, has been positively harmful for most people. How about the other economists? If economics is as bad as I say it is, what am I doing working as an economist? If irrelevance is the most benign social consequence of my professional actions and harm the more likely one, should I not change my profession to something more socially beneficial, such as electronic engineering or plumbing? I stick to economics because I believe that it does not have to be useless or harmful. After all, throughout this book I have myself used economics in trying to explain how capitalism really works. It is a particular type of economics, that is, free market economics as it has been practiced in the last few decades, that is dangerous. Throughout history, there have been many schools of economic thinking that have helped us better manage and develop our economies. To start from where we are today, what has saved the world economy from a total meltdown in the autumn of 2008 is the economics of John Maynard Keynes, Charles Kindleberger, the author of the classic book on financial crises, manias, panics, and crashes, and Hyman Minsky, the greatly undervalued American scholar of financial crises. The world economy has not descended into a rerun of the 1929 Great Depression because we absorbed their insights and bailed out key financial institutions, although we have not properly punished the bankers responsible for the mess or reformed the industry yet, increased government spending, provided stronger deposit insurance, maintained the welfare state that props up the incomes of those who are unemployed, and flushed the financial market with liquidity on an unprecedented scale. As explained in earlier things, many of these actions that have saved the world are ones opposed by free market economists of earlier generations and of today. Even though they were not trained as economists, the economic officials of East Asia knew some economics. However, especially until the 1970s, the economics they knew was mostly not of the free market variety. The economics they happened to know was the economics of Karl Marx, Friedrich List, Joseph Schumpeter, Nicholas Kaldor and Albert Hirschman. Of course, These economists lived in different times, contended with different problems and had radically differing political views, ranging from the very right-wing list to very left-wing Marx. However, there was a commonality between their economics. It was the recognition that capitalism develops through long-term investments and technological innovations that transform the productive structure, and not merely an expansion of existing structures, like inflating a balloon. Many of the things that the East Asian government officials did in the miracle years, protecting infant industries, forcefully mobilizing resources away from technologically stagnant agriculture into the dynamic industrial sector and exploiting what Hirschman called the linkages across different sectors, derive from such economic views, rather than the free market view. See Thing 7. Had the East Asian countries, and indeed most of the rich countries in Europe and North America before them, run their economies according to the principles of free market economics, they would not have developed their economies in the way they have. The economics of Herbert Simon and his followers has really changed the way we understand modern firms and, more broadly, the modern economy. It helps us break away from the myth that our economy is exclusively populated by rational self-seekers interacting through the market mechanism. When we understand that the modern economy is populated by people with limited rationality and complex motives, who are organized in a complex way, combining markets, public and private bureaucracies and networks, we begin to understand that our economy cannot be run according to free market economics. When we more closely observe the more successful firms, governments and countries, we see they are the ones that have this kind of nuanced view of capitalism, not the simplistic free market view. Even within the dominant school of economics, that is, the neoclassical school, which provides much of the foundation for free market economics, there are theories that explain why free markets are likely to produce suboptimal results. These are theories of market failure, or welfare economics, first proposed by the early 20th century Cambridge professor Arthur Pigot, and later developed by modern-day economists such as Amartya Sen, William Baumol and Joseph Stiglitz, to name just a few of the most important ones. Free market economists, of course, have either ignored these other economists or, worse, dismissed them as false prophets. These days, few of the above-mentioned economists, except those belonging to the market failure school, are even mentioned in the leading economics textbooks, let alone properly taught. But the events that have been unfolding for the last 3 decades have shown that we actually have a lot more positive things to learn from these other economists than from free market economists. The relative successes and failures of different firms, economies and policies during this period suggest that the views of these economists who are now ignored, or even forgotten, have important lessons to teach us. Economics does not have to be useless or harmful. We just have to learn right kinds of economics. Conclusion. How to rebuild the world economy. The daunting task ahead of us is to completely rebuild the world economy. Things are not as bad as they were during the Great Depression only because governments have propped up demand through huge deficit spending and unprecedented easing of money supply. The Bank of England has never had a lower interest rate since it was founded in 1644, while preventing bank runs through expansion of deposit insurance and the bailing out of many financial firms. Without these measures and the substantial automatic increase in welfare spending, e.g., unemployment benefit, we could be living through a much worse economic crisis than that of the 1930s. There are people who believe the currently dominant free market system to be fundamentally sound. They assume that tinkering on the margins will be a sufficient solution to our condition, a bit more transparency here, a tad more regulation there, and a modicum of restraints on executive pay over there. However, as I have tried to show, the fundamental theoretical and empirical assumptions behind free market economics are highly questionable. Nothing short of a total re-envisioning of the way we organize our economy and society will do. So what is to be done? This is not a place to spell out all the detailed proposals required for the reconstruction of the world economy, many of which have been discussed in the foregoing 23 things anyway. Here I will only outline some principles, 8 of them, that I think we need to have in mind in redesigning our economic system. To begin with, paraphrasing what Winston Churchill once said about democracy, let me restate my earlier position that capitalism is the worst economic system except for all the others. My criticism is of free market capitalism, and not all kinds of capitalism. The profit motive is still the most powerful and effective fuel to power our economy, and we should exploit it to the full. But we must remember that letting it loose without any restraint is not the best way to make the most of it, as we have learned at great cost over the last 3 decades. Likewise, the market is an exceptionally effective mechanism for coordinating complex economic activities across numerous economic agents, but it is no more than that, a mechanism, a machine. And like all machines, it needs careful regulation and steering. In the same way that a car can be used to kill people when driven by a drunken driver, or to save lives when it helps us deliver an emergency patient to hospital in time, the market can do wonderful things but also deplorable ones. The same car can be made better by putting in improved brakes, more powerful engines or more efficient fuel, and the same market can be made to perform better through appropriate changes to the attitudes of the participants, their motives and the rules that govern it. There are different ways to organize capitalism. Free market capitalism is only one of them, and not a very good one at that. The last 3 decades have shown that, contrary to the claims of its proponents, it slows down the economy, increases inequality and insecurity, and leads to more frequent, and sometimes massive, financial crashes. There is no one ideal model. American capitalism is very different from Scandinavian capitalism, which in turn differs from the German or French varieties, not to speak of the Japanese form. For example, countries which find American-style economic inequality unacceptable, which some may not, may reduce it through a welfare state financed by high progressive income taxes, as in Sweden, or through restrictions on money-making opportunities themselves by, say, making the opening of large retail stores difficult, as in Japan. There is no simple way to choose between the two, even though I personally think that the Swedish model is better than the Japanese one, at least in this respect. So capitalism, yes, but we need to end our love affair with unrestrained free market capitalism, which has served humanity so poorly, and install a better regulated variety. What that variety would be depends on our goals, values and beliefs. Second, we should build our new economic system on the recognition that human rationality is severely limited. The 2008 crisis has revealed how the complexity of the world we have created, especially in the sphere of finance, has vastly outpaced our ability to understand and control it. Our economic system has had a mighty fall because it was rewired following the advice of economists who believe the human ability to deal with complexity is essentially unlimited. The new world should be formed with a clear recognition that we have only limited powers of objective reasoning. It is suggested that we can prevent another major financial crisis by enhancing transparency. This is wrong. The fundamental problem is not our lack of information but our limited ability to process it. Indeed, if lack of transparency was the problem, the Scandinavian countries, famously transparent, would not have experienced a financial crisis in the early 1990s. As long as we continue to allow unlimited financial innovations, our ability to regulate will always be outstripped by our ability to innovate. If we are really serious about preventing another crisis like the 2008 meltdown, we should simply ban complex financial instruments, unless they can be unambiguously shown to benefit society in the long run. This idea will be dismissed by some as outrageous. It's not. We do that all the time with other products. Think about the safety standards for food, drugs, automobiles and aeroplanes. What would result is an approval process whereby the impact of each new financial instrument, concocted by rocket scientists within financial firms, is assessed in terms of risks and rewards to our system as a whole in the long run, and not just in terms of short-term profits for those firms. Third, while acknowledging that we are not selfless angels, we should build a system that brings out the best, rather than worst, in people. Free market ideology is built on the belief that people won't do anything good unless they are paid for it or punished for not doing it. This belief is then applied asymmetrically and reconceived as the view that rich people need to be motivated to work by further riches, while poor people must fear poverty for their motivation. Material self-interest is a powerful motive. The communist system turned out to be unviable because it ignored, or rather wanted to deny, this human driver. This does not, however, prove that material self-interest is our only motive. People are not as much propelled by material self-interest as free market textbooks claim. If the real world were as full of rational self-seeking agents as the one depicted in those textbooks, it would collapse under the weight of continuous cheating, monitoring, punishment and bargaining. Moreover, by glorifying the pursuit of material self-interest by individuals and corporations, we have created a world where material enrichment absolves individuals and corporations of other responsibilities to society. In the process, we have allowed our bankers and fund managers, directly and indirectly, to destroy jobs, shut down factories, damage our environment and ruin the financial system itself in the pursuit of individual enrichment. If we are to prevent this kind of thing happening again, we should build a system where material enrichment is taken seriously but is not allowed to become the only goal. Organizations, be they corporations or government departments, should be designed to reward trust, solidarity, honesty and cooperation among their members. The financial system needs to be reformed to reduce the influence of short-term shareholders so that companies can afford to pursue goals other than short-term profit maximization. We should better reward behavior with public benefits, e.g., reducing energy consumption, investment in training, not simply through government subsidies but also by bestowing it with a higher social status. This is not just a moral argument. It is also an appeal to enlightened self-interest. By letting short-term self-interest rule everything, we risk destroying the entire system, which serves no one's interest in the long run. Fourth, we should stop believing that people are always paid what they deserve. People from poor countries are, individually, often more productive and entrepreneurial than their counterparts in rich countries. Should they be given equal opportunity through free immigration, these people can, and will, replace the bulk of the workforce in rich countries, even though that would be politically unacceptable and undesirable. Thus seen, it is the national economic systems and immigration control of the rich countries, rather than their lack of personal qualities, that keep poor people in poor countries poor. Emphasizing that many people stay poor because they do not have true equal opportunity is not to say that they deserve to remain poor insofar as they have had equal opportunity. Unless there is some equalizing in outcome, especially, although not exclusively, so that all children can have more than minimum nutrition and parental attention, the equality of opportunity provided by the market mechanism will not guarantee truly fair competition. It will be like a race where no one has a head start but some people run with weights on their legs. At the other end of the spectrum, executive pay in the US has gone into the stratosphere in the last few decades. US managers have increased their relative pay by at least 10 times between the 1950s and today, an average CEO used to get paid 35 times an average worker's salary then, while today he is paid 300 to 400 times that. But that is not because their productivity has risen 10 times faster than that of their workers. Even excluding stock options, US managers are paid 2.5 times what their Dutch counterparts are or 4 times what their Japanese counterparts are, despite no apparent superiority in their productivity. Only when we are free to question the hand of cards that the market has dealt us will we be able to find ways to establish a more just society. We can, and should, change the rules of the stock market and the corporate governance system in order to restrain excessive executive pay in limited liability companies. We should not only provide equal opportunity but also equalize, to an extent, the starting points for all children for a truly meritocratic society. People should be given a real, not superficial, second chance through unemployment benefits and publicly subsidized retraining. Poor people in poor countries should not be blamed for their poverty, when the bigger explanations lie in the poverty of their national economic systems and immigration control in the rich countries. Market outcomes are not natural phenomena. They can be changed. Fifth, we need to take making things more seriously. The post-industrial knowledge economy is a myth. The manufacturing sector remains vital. Especially in the US and the UK, but also in many other countries, industrial decline in the last few decades has been treated as an inevitability of a post-industrial age, if not actively welcomed as a sign of post-industrial success. But we are material beings and cannot live on ideas, however great the knowledge economy may sound. Moreover, we have always lived in a knowledge economy in the sense that it has always been a command over superior knowledge, rather than the physical nature of activities, that has ultimately decided which country is rich or poor. Indeed, most societies are still making more and more things. It is mainly because those who make things have become so much more productive that things have become cheaper, in relative terms, than services that we think we don't consume as many things as before. Unless you are a tiny tax haven, a status that is going to become more and more difficult to maintain, following the 2008 crisis, such as Luxembourg and Monaco, or a small country floating on oil, such as Brunei or Kuwait, you have to become better at making things in order to raise your living standard. Switzerland and Singapore, which are often touted as post-industrial success stories, are in fact two of the most industrialized economies in the world. Moreover, most high-value services are dependent, sometimes even parasitic, on the manufacturing sector, e.g., finance, technical consulting. And services are not very tradable, so an overly large service sector makes your balance of payments situation more precarious and thus your economic growth more difficult to sustain. The myth of the post-industrial knowledge economy has also misdirected our investments. It has encouraged excessive emphasis on, for example, formal education, whose impact on economic growth turns out to be highly complex and uncertain, and on the spread of the internet, whose productivity impacts are actually quite modest. Investment in boring things like machinery, infrastructure and worker training needs to be encouraged through appropriate changes in tax rules, e.g., accelerated depreciation for machinery, subsidies, e.g., to worker training, or public investment, e.g., redirection into infrastructural development. Industrial policy needs to be redesigned to promote key manufacturing sectors with high scope for productivity growth. Sixth, we need to strike a better balance between finance and real activities. A productive modern economy cannot exist without a healthy financial sector. Finance plays, among other things, the crucial role of resolving the mismatch between the act of investment and the bearing of its fruits. By liquidizing physical assets whose characteristics cannot be changed quickly, finance also helps us to reallocate resources quickly. However, in the last 3 decades, finance has become the proverbial tail that wags the dog. Financial liberalization has made it easier for money to move around, even across national borders, allowing financial investors to become more impatient for instant results. As a consequence, both corporations and governments have been forced to implement policies that produce quick profits, regardless of their long-term implications. Financial investors have utilized their greater mobility as a bargaining chip in extracting a bigger share of national income. Easier movement of finance has also resulted in greater financial instability and greater job insecurity, which is needed for delivering quick profits. Finance needs to be slowed down. Not to put us back to the days of debtor's prison and small workshops financed by personal savings. But, unless we vastly reduce the speed gap between finance and the real economy, we will not encourage long-term investment and real growth, because productive investments often take a long time to bear fruit. It took Japan 40 years of protection and government subsidies before its automobile industry could be an international success, even at the lower end of the market. It took Nokia 17 years before it made any profit in the electronics business, where it is one of the world leaders today. However, following the increasing degree of financial deregulation, the world has operated with increasingly shorter time horizons. Financial transaction taxes, restrictions on cross-border movement of capital, especially movements in and out of developing countries, greater restrictions on mergers and acquisitions are some of the measures that will slow down finance to the speed at which it helps, rather than weakens or even derails, the real economy. 7th. Government needs to become bigger and more active. In the last 3 decades, we have been constantly told by free market ideologues that the government is part of the problem, not a solution to the ills of our society. True, there are instances of government failure, sometimes spectacular ones, but markets and corporations fail too and, more importantly, there are many examples of impressive government success. The role of the government needs to be thoroughly reassessed. This is not just about crisis management, evident since 2008, even in the avowedly free market economies, such as the US. It is more about creating a prosperous, equitable and stable society. Despite its limitations and despite numerous attempts to weaken it, democratic government is, at least so far, the best vehicle we have for reconciling conflicting demands in our society and, more importantly, improving our collective well-being. In considering how we can make the best out of the government, we need to abandon some of the standard trade-offs bandied about by free market economists. We have been told that a big government, which collects high income taxes from the wealthy and redistributes them to the poor, is bad for growth, as it discourages wealth creation by the rich and makes lower classes lazy. However, if having a small government is good for economic growth, many developing countries that have such a government should do well. Evidently, this is not the case. At the same time, the Scandinavian examples, where a large welfare state has coexisted with, or even encouraged, good growth performance, should also expose the limits to the belief that smaller governments are always better for growth. Free market economists have also told us that active or intrusive, as they put it, governments are bad for economic growth. However, contrary to common perception, virtually all of today's rich countries used government intervention to get rich. If you are still not convinced about this point, see my earlier book, Bad Samaritans. If designed and implemented appropriately, government intervention can increase economic dynamism by augmenting the supply of inputs that markets are bad at supplying, e.g. R&D, worker training, sharing risk for projects with high social returns but low private returns, and, in developing countries, providing the space in which nascent firms in infant industries can develop their productive capabilities. We need to think more creatively how the government becomes an essential element in an economic system where there is more dynamism, greater stability and more acceptable levels of equity. This means building a better welfare state, a better regulatory system, especially for finance, and better industrial policy. 8th. The world economic system needs to unfairly favor developing countries. Because of the constraints imposed by their democratic checks, the free market advocates in most rich countries have actually found it difficult to implement full-blown free market reform. Even Margaret Thatcher found it impossible to consider dismantling the National Health Service. As a result, it was actually developing countries that have been the main subjects of free market policy experiments. Many poorer countries, especially in Africa and Latin America, have been forced to adopt free market policies in order to borrow money from free market-loving international financial organizations, such as the IMF and the World Bank, and rich country governments, that also ultimately control the IMF and the World Bank. The weakness of their democracies meant that free market policies could be implemented more ruthlessly in developing countries, even when they hurt a lot of people. This is the ultimate irony of all. People needing most help were worst hit. This tendency was reinforced by the strengthening of global rules over the last couple of decades on what governments can do to protect and develop their economies, more necessary in the poor countries, through the establishment or strengthening of organizations such as the WTO, the BIS and various bilateral and regional free trade and investment agreements. The result has been a much more thorough implementation of free market policies and much worse performance in terms of growth, stability and inequality than in developed countries. The world economic system needs to be completely overhauled in order to provide greater policy space for the developing countries to pursue policies that are more suitable to them. The rich countries have much greater scope to bend, or even ignore, international rules. The developing countries need a more permissive regime regarding the use of protectionism, regulation of foreign investment and intellectual property rights, among Others. These are policies that the rich countries actually used when they were developing countries themselves. All this requires a reform of the WTO, abolition and/or reform of existing bilateral trade and investment agreements between rich and poor countries, and changes in the policy conditions attached to loans from international financial organizations and to foreign aid from the rich countries. Of course, these things are unfairly favorable to the developing countries, as some rich countries would argue. However, developing countries already suffer from so many disadvantages in the international system that they need these breaks to have a hope of catching up. The 8 principles all directly go against the received economic wisdom of the last 3 decades. This will have made some readers uncomfortable. But unless we now abandon the principles that have failed us and that are continuing to hold us back, we will meet similar disasters down the road. And we will have done nothing to alleviate the conditions of billions suffering poverty and insecurity, especially, but not exclusively, in the developing world. It is time to get uncomfortable. Acknowledgements. I have benefited from many people in writing this book. Having played such a pivotal role in bringing about my previous book, Bad Samaritans, which focused on the developing world, Ivan Mulcahy, my literary agent, gave me constant encouragement to write another book with a broader appeal. Peter Jinnah, my editor at Bloomsbury, USA, not only provided valuable editorial feedback but also played a crucial role in setting the tone of the book by coming up with the title, 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, while I was conceptualizing the book. William Goodlad, my editor at Allen Lane, took the lead in the editorial work and did a superb job in getting everything just right. Many people read chapters of the book and provided helpful comments. Duncan Green read all the chapters and gave me very useful advice, both content-wise and editorially. Jeff Harcourt and Deepak Nayar read many of the chapters and provided sagacious advice. Dirk Bessemer, Chris Kramer, Shailaja Fennell, Patrick Imam, Deborah Johnston, Amy Klatskin, Barry Lynn, Kenya Parsons, and Bob Rowthorne read various chapters and gave me valuable comments. Without the help of my capable research assistants, I could not have got all the detailed information on which the book is built. I thank, in alphabetical order, Bhargav Advaryu, Hassan Akram, Antonio Andreoni, Yurendra Basnet, Muhammad Irfan, Virayuth Kanchuchat, and Francesca Reinhardt for their assistance. I also would like to thank Sungil Jung and Bum Lee for providing me with data that are not easily accessible. Last but not least, I thank my family, without whose support and love the book would not have been finished. Hee Jung, my wife, not only gave me strong emotional support while I was writing the book but also read all the chapters and helped me formulate my arguments in a more coherent and user-friendly way. I was extremely pleased to see that, when I floated some of my ideas to Yuna, my daughter, she responded with a surprising intellectual maturity for a 14-year-old. Jin Gyu, my son, gave me some very interesting ideas as well as a lot of moral support for the book. I dedicate this book to the 3 of them. Notes. Thing 1.1 on how tariff, hampering free trade in goods, was another important issue in the making of the American Civil War. See my earlier book Kicking Away the Ladder. Development Strategy and Historical Perspective, Anthem Press, London, 2002, pp. 24-8 and references thereof. Thing 2.1a. Smith, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, Clarendon Press, Oxford, 1976, page 741. 2n. Rosenberg and L. Birdsall, How the West Grew Rich, I.B. Tauris and Company, London, 1986, page 200. 3a. Glynn, Capitalism Unleashed, Finance, Globalization, and Welfare, Oxford. University Press, Oxford, 2004, page 7, Fig. 1.3. 4j. G. Palma, The Revenge of the Market on the Rentiers. Why Neoliberal Reports on the End of History Turned Out to Be Premature, Cambridge Journal of Economics, 2009, Volume 33, Number 4, page 851, Fig. 12. 5cw. Lazonic and M. O'Sullivan, Maximizing Shareholder Value. A New Ideology for Corporate Governance, Economy and Society, 2000, Volume 29, Number 1, and W. Lazonic, The Buyback Boondoggle, Business Week, the 24th of August 2009. 6 Lazonic, Op. Cit. Thing 4.1r. Sardi, Domestic Service, Past and Present in Southern and Northern Europe. Gender and History, 2006, Volume 18, Number 2, page 223, Table 1. 2 is cited in J. Greenwood, A. Seshadri and M. Yorukolu, Engines of Liberation. Review of Economic Studies, 2005, Volume 72, page 112. 3c. Golden, The Quiet Revolution That Transformed Women's Employment, Education, and Family, American Economic Review, 2006, Volume 96, Number 2, page 4, Fig. 1. 4i. Rubinow, The Problem of Domestic Service, Journal of Political Economy, 1906, Volume 14, Number 8, page 505. 5. The book is H.J. Chang and I. Grabble, Reclaiming Development, an Alternative. Economic Policy Manual, Z Press, London, 2004. 6. K. Ome, The Borderless World, Power and Strategy in the Interlinked Economy, Harper and Row, New York, 1990. Thing 5.1. An accessible summary of the academic literature on the complexity of human motivations can be found in B. Frey, Not Just for the Money, Economic Theory of Personal Motivation, Edward Elgar, Cheltenham, 1997. 2. The example is an elaboration of the one used by K. Basu, on Why We Do Not Try to Walk Off Without Paying After a Taxi Ride, Economic and Political Weekly, 1983, number 48. Thing 6.1s. Fisher, Maintaining Price Stability, Finance and Development, December 1996. 2. A study by Robert Barrow, a leading free market economist, concludes that moderate inflation, 10 to 20%, has low negative effects on growth, and that, below 10%, inflation has no effect at all. C.R. Barrow, Inflation and Growth, Review of Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, 1996, Volume 78, Number 3. A study by Michael Sarrell, an IMF economist, estimates that below 8% inflation has little impact on growth. If anything, he points out, the relationship is positive below that level. That is, inflation helps rather than hinders growth. C.M. Sarrell, Nonlinear Effects of Inflation on Economic Growth, IMF Staff Papers, 1996, Volume 43, March. 3. C.M. Bruno, Does Inflation Really Lower Growth? Finance and Development, 1995, Volume 32, pp. 35-8, M. Bruno and W. Easterly, Inflation and Growth, In Search of a Stable Relationship, Review of Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, 1996, Volume 78, Number 3. 4. In the 1960s, Korea's inflation rate was much higher than that of 5 Latin American countries: Venezuela, Bolivia, Mexico, Peru and Colombia, and not much lower than that of Argentina. In the 1970s, the Korean inflation rate was higher than that found in Venezuela, Ecuador and Mexico, and not much lower than that of Colombia and Bolivia. The information is from A. Singh, How Did East Asia Grow So Fast? Slow Progress Towards an Analytical Consensus, 1995, UNCTAD Discussion Paper, Number 97, Table 8. 5. There are many different ways to calculate profit rates, but the relevant concept here is returns on assets. According to S. Claessens, S. Jankov and L. Lang, Corporate Growth, Financing, and Risks in the Decades Before East Asia's Financial Crisis, 1998, Policy. Research Working Paper, No. 2017, World Bank, Washington, D.C., Fig. 1. The returns on assets in 46 developed and developing countries during 1988 to 96 ranged between 3.3%, Austria, and 9.8%, Thailand. The ratio ranged between 4% and 7% in 40 of the 46 countries. It was below 4% in 3 countries and above 7% in 3 countries. Another World Bank study puts the average profit rate for non-financial firms in emerging market economies, middle-income countries, during the 1990s, 1992 to 2001, at an even lower level of 3.1%, net income, assets. C.S. Mohapatra, D. Rotha and P. Subtle, Corporate Financing Patterns and Performance in Emerging Markets, Mimeo. March 2003, World Bank, Washington, D.C. 6. C. Reinhardt and K. Rogoff, This Time is Different, Princeton University Press. Princeton and Oxford, 2008, page 252, Fig. 16.1. Thing 7.1 on Lincoln's protectionist views. See my earlier book Kicking Away the Ladder, Anthem Press, London, 2002, pp. 27-8 and the references thereof. 2. This story is told in greater detail in my earlier books. Kicking Away the Ladder is a heavily referenced and annotated academic, but by no means difficult to read, monograph, focused particularly on trade policy, Bad Samaritans, Random House. London, 2007, and Bloomsbury, USA, New York, 2008, covers a broader range of policy areas and is written in a more user-friendly way. Thing 8.1 for further evidence, see my recent book Bad Samaritans, Random House, London, 2007, and Bloomsbury, USA, New York, 2008, ch. 4, The Fin and the Elephant, and R. Kozel Wright and P. Raymond, The Resistible Rise of Market Fundamentalism, Z Books, London, 2007, ch. 4. Thing 9.1 K. Coots, A. Glynn and B. Rowthorne, Structural Change Under New Labour. Cambridge Journal of Economics, 2007, Volume 31, Number 5. 2. The term is borrowed from the 2008 report by the British government's Department for Business, Enterprise and Regulatory Reform, Globalization and the Changing UK Economy, 2008. 3b. Alford, Deindustrialization, Refresh, Autumn 1997, page 6, Table 1. 4b. Rowthorne and K. Coutts, Deindustrialization and the Balance of Payments in Advanced Economies, Cambridge Journal of Economics, 2004, Volume 28, Number 5. Thing 10-1t. Gilfison, Why Europe Works Less and Grows Taller, Challenge, 2007. January, February. Thing 11-1p. Collier and J. Gunning, Why Has Africa Grown Slowly? Journal of Economic Perspectives, 1999, Volume 13, Number 3, page 4. 2. Daniel Itang Amangel, a Cameroonian engineer and writer, notes, the African, anchored in his ancestral culture, is so convinced that the past can only repeat itself that he worries only superficially about the future. However, without a dynamic perception of the future, there is no planning, no foresight, no scenario building, in other words, no policy to affect the course of events, page 69. And then he goes on to say that African societies are like a football team in which, as a result of personal rivalries and a lack of team spirit, one player will not pass the ball to another out of fear that the latter might score a goal, p. 75. D. Itang Amangel, does Africa need a cultural adjustment program? In L. Harrison and S. Huntington eds. Culture Matters, How Values Shape Human Progress, Basic Books, New York, 2000. 3. According to Weber, in 1863, around a quarter of France's population did not speak French. In the same year, 11% of schoolchildren aged 7 to 13 spoke no French at all, while another 37% spoke or understood it but could not write it. E. Weber, Peasants into Frenchmen. The Modernization of Rural France, 1870 to 1914. Stanford University Press, Stanford, 1976, page 67. 4. Ch.J. Chang, Underexplored Treasure Troves of Development Lessons, Lessons from the Histories of Small Rich European Countries, SRECs, in M. Kramer, P. Van Lieshoust and R. Wendt, eds. Doing Good or Doing Better, Development Policies in a Globalizing World, Amsterdam University Press, Amsterdam, 2009, and H.J. Chang, Economic History of the Developed World, Lessons for Africa, a lecture delivered in the Eminent Speakers Program of the African Development Bank, the 26th of February 2009, can be downloaded from http://www.econ.cam.ac/faculty/chong/pubs/chongifdblecturetext.pdf. 5. Ch.J. Chang, How Important Were the Initial Conditions for Economic Development, East Asia versus Sub-Saharan Africa, ch. 4, in H.J. Chang, The East Asian Development Experience. The Miracle, the Crisis, and the Future, Z Press, London, 2006. 6. For comparison of the quality of institutions in today's rich countries when they were at similar levels of development with those found in today's developing countries, c. H.J. Chang, Kicking Away the Ladder, Anthem Press, London, 2002, ch. 3. Thing 12.1 for a user-friendly explanation and criticism of the theory of comparative advantage. See, My 6-year-old son should get a job. Ch. 3 of My Bad Samaritans. Random House, London, 2007, and Bloomsbury, USA, New York, 2008. 2 further details can be found from my earlier books, Kicking Away the Ladder, Anthem Press, London, 2002, and Bad Samaritans. Thing 13.1 The 16 countries where inequality increased are, in descending order of income inequality as of 2000, the US, South Korea, the UK, Israel, Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, Japan, Australia, Canada, Sweden, Norway, Belgium, Finland, Luxembourg and Austria. The 4 countries where income inequality fell were Germany, Switzerland, France and Denmark. 2. L. Mischel, J. Bernstein and H. Shearholes, The State of Working America, 2008 9th, Economic Policy Institute, Washington, D.C., 2009, page 26, Table 3. 3. According to the OECD, Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation, before taxes and transfers, the U.S., as of mid-2000s, had a Gini coefficient, the measure of income inequality, with 0 as absolute equality and 1 as absolute inequality. Of 0.46. The figures were 0.51 for Germany, 0.49 for Belgium, 0.44 for Japan, 0.43 for Sweden and 0.42 for the Netherlands. Thing 14 1L, Michel, J. Bernstein and H. Shearholes, The State of Working America, 2008 9th. Economic Policy Institute, Washington, D.C., 2009, Table 3.2. 2 IBID. Table 3.1. 3 feet should Congress put a cap on executive pay? New York Times, the 3rd of January 2009. 4 Michel et al. Op. CIT, Table 3, A2. The 13 countries are Australia, Belgium, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland and the UK. 5 IBID. Table 3, A2. 6 L. A. Bebchik and J. M. Fried, Executive Compensation as an Agency Problem. Journal of Economic Perspectives, 2003, Volume 17, Number 3, page 81. Thing 1510ECD is informal normal. Towards more and better jobs in developing countries, 2009. 2D. Rudman and J. Mordich, The Impact of Microcredit on the Poor in Bangladesh. Revisiting the Evidence, 2009, Working Paper, Number 174, Center for Global Development. Washington, D.C. 3M. Bateman, Why Doesn't Microfinance Work? Z Books, London, 2010. Thing 16-1 Mansion House Speech, the 19th of June 2009. 2 for a very engaging and user-friendly presentation of the researches on the irrational side of human nature, CP. Ubel, Free Market Madness. Why Human Nature is at Odds with Economics, and Why It Matters, Harvard Business School Press, Boston, 2009. Thing 17-1J. Samoff, Education for All in Africa, Still a Distant Dream, in R. Arnaud and C. Torres, eds. Comparative Education, The Dialectic of the Global and the Local, Roman and Littlefield Publishers Inc., Lanham, Maryland, 2007, page 361, table 16.3. 2L. Pritchett, Where Has All the Education Gone? The World Bank Economic Review, 2001, volume 13, number 3. 3A. Wolf, Does Education Matter? Penguin Books, London, 2002, page 42. 4 in the 8th grade, the U.S. overtook Lithuania, but was still behind Russia and Hungary. 4th grader score for Hungary and 8th grader scores for Latvia and Kazakhstan are not available. 5 the other European countries were, in order of their rankings in the test, Germany, Denmark, Italy, Austria, Sweden, Scotland and Norway. See the website of the National Center for Educational Statistics of the U.S. Department of Education Institute of Education Sciences, http://nces.ed.gov/tim/table07_1.asp. 6 the other rich countries were, in order of their rankings in the test, Japan, England, the U.S., Australia, Sweden, Scotland and Italy. See the above website. 7 the most influential works in this school of thought were Harry Braverman's Labor and Monopoly Capital, The Degradation of Work in the 20th Century, Monthly Review Press, New York, 1974, and Stephen Marglin's What Do Bosses Do? Published in 2 parts in the Review of Radical Political Economy in 1974 and 1975. 8 Wolf, Op. CIT, page 264. 9 on the issue of sorting and many other insightful observations on the role of education in economic development. See Wolf, Op. CIT. Thing 18-1R. Blackburn, Finance and the Fourth Dimension, New Left Review, May, June 2006, page 44. Thing 19-1 The share of federal government in total R&D spending in the U.S. was 53.6% in 1953, 56.8% in 1955, 64.6% in 1960, 64.9% in 1965, 57.1% in 1970, 51.7% in 1975, 47.2% in 1980, 47.9% in 1985 and 47.3% in 1989, estimated. C.D. Mowery and N. Rosenberg, The U.S. National Innovation System, in R. Nelson, ed. National Innovation Systems, Oxford University Press, New York and Oxford, 1993, page 41, table 2.3. 2H. Simon, Organizations and Markets, Journal of Economic Perspectives, 1991, volume 5, number 2, page 27. Thing 21 on how the Confucian culture was not a cause of East Asian economic development. See, Lazy Japanese and Thieving Germans, ch. 9 in my book Bad Samaritans. Random House, London, 2007, and Bloomsbury, USA, New York, 2008. 2 M. Yanti et al. American Exceptionalism in a New Light, a comparison of intergenerational earnings mobility in the Nordic countries, the United Kingdom and the United States, the Warwick Economic Research Paper Series, Department of Economics. University of Warwick, October 2005. Thing 2110 OECD is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It is the club of the rich countries, with several members describing whom as rich may be debatable, such as Portugal, Korea, Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovak Republic, Poland, Mexico and Turkey, in descending order of per capita income. Of these, Portugal and Korea are the richest, with around $18,000 per capita income in 2006, and Turkey the poorest, with per capita income of $5,400 in 2006. The next poorest OECD member after Portugal and Korea is Greece, which has a per capita income over $24,000. In 2003, the latest year for which the OECD has the data, public social spending accounted for 5.7% of GDP in Korea. The highest was Sweden, with 31.3%. The OECD average was 20.7%. See OECD Factbook 2008, Economic, Environmental and Social Statistics. 2 in 2003, the latest year for which the OECD has the data, public social spending accounted for 16.2% of GDP in the US, compared to the OECD average of 20.7% and the EU 15 average of 23.9%. Among the OECD member states, only Korea, 5.7%, and Mexico, 6.8%, two countries that are usually not considered fully developed, had a lower ratio. IBID, Thing 22-1R. Ports and F. Baldursson, The Internationalization of Iceland's Financial Sector, Iceland Chamber of Commerce, Reykjavik, 2007, page 6. 2G. Dumenil and D. Levy, Costs and Benefits of Neoliberalism, A Class Analysis in G. Epstein, ed. Financialization in the World Economy, Edward Elgar, Cheltenham, 2005. 3J. Crotty, If Financial Market Competition is so intense, why are financial firm profits so high? Reflections on the Current, Golden Age, of Finance, Working Paper, No. 134, Perry, Political Economy Research Institute, University of Massachusetts, Amherst. April 2007. The information for GE is from R. Blackburn, Finance and the Fourth Dimension. New Left Review, May, June 2006, page 44. J. Froud et al. Financialization and Strategy. Narrative and Numbers, Routledge, London, 2006, estimates that the ratio could be as high as 50%. The Ford number comes from the Froud et al. Study and the GM number from the Blackburn study. 5J. G. Palma, The Revenge of the Market on the Rentiers. Why Neoliberal Reports of the End of History Turned Out to Be Premature, Cambridge Journal of Economics, 2009, Volume 33, Number 4. Thing 23-1 Your per capita income will double in 10 years, if you are a miracle economy growing at 7%. If you are a golden age economy growing at 3.5% per year per capita, it will take around 20 years to double your per capita income. In those 20 years, per capita income of the miracle economy will have quadrupled. In contrast, it will take around 70 years for an industrial revolution economy, growing at 1% in per capita terms, to double its per capita income. 2. The letter can be downloaded from the website, http://media.ft.com/cms/3E3B6C87A08-11-B86F-00144 Copyright 2010 by Ha-Jun Chang. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be used or reproduced in any manner whatsoever without written permission from the publisher except in the case of brief quotations embodied in critical articles or reviews. For information address Bloomsbury Press, 175 Fifth Avenue, New York. New York, 10010. Published by Bloomsbury Press, New York. Library of Congress cataloging and publication data has been applied. 4. ISBN 978-1-60819-1666, hardcover. First published in Great Britain in 2010 by Alan Lane, an imprint of Penguin Books. First published in the United States by Bloomsbury Press in 2011. This e-book edition published in 2011. E-book ISBN 978-1-60819-358-5 www.bloomsburypress.com. Your gateway to knowledge and culture. Accessible for everyone. Official Telegram channel Z access https://wikipedia.org/wiki/z-library z-library.skz-lib.gs-lib.fm go-to-library.sk. This file was downloaded from Z Library Project.